Chapter 12. Maggie heard the doorbell. It raked across her nerves, pulling them right to the surface. She closed her eyes as she prayed for courage and sanity, and anything else she might need to get through this night. The dress was far better than anything else she'd tried on that day. However, it was much shorter than what she was used to wearing. On her way out the door, she tugged the skirt down, trying to get it below her knees. "Stop fidgeting, Maggie," she berated herself. "Stop it." But still, she fidgeted. She couldn't help it. Carefully, she descended the stairs, feeling like it was the night of a prom she'd never gone to. She certainly couldn't have gotten any more nervous had she been in a formal gown with a corsage on her wrist. At the bottom of the steps by the door stood Greg with Inez. When he looked up, he smiled. "Well, hello there." His gaze stayed on her all the way to the bottom. In all of her memory, she couldn't remember anybody ever looking at her like that. "I'd better get back to the kitchen," Inez said, and she removed herself from the situation. Greg surveyed her. "You look beautiful." Once more, she smoothed the skirt down. "Thanks." He offered her his arm. "Shall we?" Keith was midway through pouring Tracy wine when movement at the patio door caught his attention. He looked up, and everything else dropped away. There, on the arm of his best friend, was every dream he'd ever had. The smoky gray dress hugged her curves and set off the mass of waves undulating around her face. "Oh, Greg, you made it!" Dallas greeted them like a 4-star hostess. "And you must be Maggie. Hi, I'm Dallas." "It's nice to meet you." Maggie put out her hand, and Keith had to force the air into his lungs. "Hey, Keith, man." Greg put his hand in the air, and Keith caught it as he had countless times. But never before had his gaze stayed on the beauty standing behind his best friend. "Thanks for asking us. This is Maggie." "Maggie," Keith said, holding out his hand to her like he'd been caught in a trance. "Hi, thanks for asking us." "Our pleasure." Man, she was going to be hard not to watch all night. "Pâté?" Dallas asked, stepping up with a silver serving tray. "Oh, thanks." Maggie took a small piece of bread with a meat spread on it. She took a bite, and Keith had to keep from laughing at the look on her face. "Hi, Greg," Tracy, Dallas's best friend and maid of honor, said as she stepped up. From Keith's recollection, Tracy and Greg had been out about 3 times when they were all in college. If his memory served correctly, Greg's exact assessment was, "Too much drama for me." "Tracy." Greg put his arm around Maggie, apparently to emphasize he had a date, and Keith's fist balled automatically. "This is Maggie Montgomery." "Oh." Tracy spun her wine glass toward her face. "Do you work with Greg at corporate accounting?" No." Maggie hesitated. "She works at the Ayer mansion," Greg said, pulling her closer to his side. "She's the new nanny." "Oh." Tracy dragged the single syllable to 6. "Well, I guess that's about par for the course." She surveyed Greg with smiling condescension. "We all know how you like slumming with the middle class." Had she not been a friend of Dallas, Keith would have shown her the door and thrown her out himself. "Yeah, well," Dallas sighed dramatically, trying to salvage the wreck. "I wonder what's keeping Allison and Jared. They should have been here by now." "Oh," Keith said, wanting only to put his arms around Maggie and get her out of here and away from the snobs he called friends. He hated the defenseless vulnerability on her face. "Jared called and said they were going to be a little late. He got stuck at the office." Dallas sighed again and looked at her watch. "Well, should we wait on dinner then? I told the caterer 7. Keith's concern meter was hitting overload. He wanted to protect Maggie and help Dallas, but he wasn't doing much good at either one. "We can be a little late. It won't kill anyone." Although, as he glanced at Tracy standing smugly to the side, he thought if she popped her mouth off at Maggie again, She might very well not be around to enjoy the duck à l'orange. For her part, Maggie had effectively shrunk to invisible next to Greg. "Oh, where are my manners?" Keith asked, snapping back into host mode. "Would you two like some wine?" He grabbed the bottle and 2 glasses from the serving table. "Sure," Greg said right next to Maggie, and the only thing she could think was that she never should have come. These people were way out of her league. They talked in languages she didn't understand. They ate food that tasted like it had been recycled from the trash can. And most of all, they drank. She wondered at that moment about Keith's night on the town Friday night. Was this just normal protocol with them? Drinks and more drinks. Her gut twisted around that thought. And then he was standing there in front of her with the bottle and the glass, smiling at her with that smile that reminded her so much of a guy she knew. Only that guy wore a beat-up cowboy hat and didn't go around sipping Chardonnay. Her gaze swept past him to the others. Saying it might well banish her from them forever, but the truth was, she would never be invited again anyway. That much was obvious. "I don't drink." Keith's face fell in confusion with the statement, and he looked at her like she had just dropped there from Mars. And his smile fell away as well, too. "What?" Greg asked. Maggie dragged in a breath as her gaze fought to find somewhere to look that wouldn't knife her to death. "I don't drink." She tried to smile to soften the blow as she scratched the side of her head. I hope that's not a problem." Utter silence fell over the whole place. Even the trees stopped rustling. Keith was the first to break the silence. "Of course not. I've got lots of other stuff in the kitchen. Coke, Sprite, water, whatever you want." She had never felt more rescued in her life. "Sprite, if you don't mind." Finally, his smile was back in full. "Of course. I'll be right back." He stepped past her, smelling better than any human had a right to. The whiff of soft musk cologne sent her head swimming, and her gaze followed him all the way to and through the back patio door. Tracy and Dallas were already talking about wedding plans as they took seats on the perfectly positioned outdoor furniture. Greg guided Maggie to the little swing with a metal frame that rounded up and over the top. It was on the same patio, but far enough away they could have a modicum of privacy. On the swing, he leaned toward her. "I'm really sorry about that. Tracy and I, well, we were together for a while. She can be like that sometimes." "Don't worry about it," Maggie said, trying to take her own advice. She reached over and put her hand on his knee for emphasis. "It comes with the territory." Keith stepped back into the yard and walked right over to her. "Here you are." He produced a wine glass with clear, bubbly liquid. "Enjoy." Her heart skipped through her chest. Somehow she had expected a green plastic bottle to announce to everyone how different she was. Instead, the wine glass said she fit, with no question. "Thanks." The wink was almost non-existent, but she saw it just the same. "No problem." Throughout drinks and dinner, Keith watched her. There was no doubt that this was not her element, and yet, she held her own. Allison, thankfully, was much less of a snob than Tracy, and between her and Dallas, they made sure Maggie was included as much as possible. "Nice party," Greg said, sliding up by Keith, who stood at the entertainment center talking with Jared. "Thanks." Jared excused himself and walked off. "She's something, huh?" Greg asked, indicating Maggie, who sat across the room with the women. She wasn't in the conversation, but the light that permeated her every move was right there with her. "Yeah, something. I wonder if she's, seeing anyone." The thought had never occurred to Keith. "I don't know. She came with you, didn't she?" "Yeah." Greg took a drink. "But you know my track record with women. They're always attached to someone else." The knife went right through Keith's heart. "Yeah? Well, maybe this time you'll get lucky." Greg tipped the glass up. "Here's hoping." "Thanks for coming. It was fun." Dallas stood at the top step of the guest house, Keith at her side, as Greg and Maggie stood on the porch saying their goodbyes. "Thanks for asking us. We had a good time," Greg said. "Yeah, it was wonderful," Maggie said, fighting with everything in her not to look at Keith. It was nearly impossible, but looking at him standing there with his arm around Dallas was going to kill her. "Good night," Greg said, and turned her toward the cars. "Night," Dallas called happily. Maggie would be happy too if she was going back in with Keith. The guests were gone, the party over. Now they could be alone. That thought hit her hard. It was clear Dallas was staying there. Of course Maggie wasn't naive enough to think that nothing was happening when they were alone. She closed her eyes to block out that thought. Then, just at the end of the steps, Greg swayed into her. She looked at him with concern. "Are you okay to drive?" "Yeah, I didn't have that much." Maggie glanced back at the guest house, but Dallas and Keith had already gone in. She looked back at Greg, and her mind went through the evening. 2 wines on the patio, a couple during dinner, 1 or 2 more after. With a breath, she watched him walking to the car. It was barely there, but still it was. "Maybe I should drive." Greg laughed. "We're just going to the mansion." "No, I mean, maybe I should drive you home." "Home?" He jerked backward to look at her. "I'm fine. I barely had anything." She put her arms around herself and glanced back at the house. "Yeah, well, I'd feel better if we all got home in one piece." He snorted. "If you drive me home, how are you going to get home?" There was money in her purse now. Sure, there were other things she could get, but none were more important than this. "I'll take a cab. It's no big deal." Greg looked at his watch. "But it's after 10. You won't get back here until, like, midnight." "Yeah, thus we'd better get going." She walked around the car to him. "Keys." He was obviously not ready for this confrontation, and he hesitated. However, Maggie wasn't taking no for an answer. Finally, he relinquished the keys. As he walked to the other side, she laughed. "But don't go to sleep on me. I'm going to need some directions." "That was great," Dallas said as they picked up the debris from the party. "Yeah, except Tracy's stupid comment to Maggie." Dallas waved that off. "Oh, you know how Tracy is. She talks before she thinks." Something inside of Keith lodged at the comment. He wanted to say more, but what more was there to say? "I think your friends are inconsiderate snobs?" That was honest, but not very prudent. "Oh, but didn't Greg and Maggie make the cutest couple?" Dallas cooed. "I told you he's got a thing for her. I could tell by how he looked at her. You mark my words, those two are going to get together." Worse words had never been spoken. At the front window, Keith pulled the curtain back and peered out into the darkness. They were gone, presumably to the mansion, or would Greg take her back to his place first? That was not an encouraging thought. Keith shook his head. Surely not. That was all the way back into Houston. The timing alone precluded that. Still, he couldn't help but think even if they didn't tonight, if Greg pursued this, it wouldn't be long. That's just the way things worked in their crowd. "So, Mr. Ayer," Dallas said, wrapping her arms around him from behind before he knew she was there. "What do you say I give you a little preview of June 3rd? She sidled her way around him and leaned on the windowsill. Softly, she reached up and kissed him. There was no doubt she was beautiful. There was no doubt any other man alive would have wanted her. But the sad fact was, there was also no doubt that the one woman he really wanted had just left with his best friend. That was the way things were, and although it might kill him, it was time he accepted it. "Here?" Maggie asked, turning cautiously into the driveway. "Yeah, apartment 215 at the end there." She nodded. "Just park under the awning." Again she nodded, guiding the little sports car into a space and with a sigh of relief, turning it off. The light from the headlights slashed through the night and died. They were left under the amber nightlight above. "Thanks for bringing me home," Greg said, putting his gaze to the floorboard. "You really didn't have to do that." "Yeah, well, I'd rather know you're home safe and sound than to worry about if you'd become highway pizza on the way home." She fought to make her voice light and cheerful. The night had been nice. Greg was a nice date. And overall, she knew it was a night she would remember. "You can come up," he said, glancing past her to the apartments beyond. She glanced the direction he indicated. "Oh, no, I'd better get home." "Well, you can at least come up and call the cab." That hurdle hadn't crossed her mind, but he had a point. "Okay." Nerves like she'd never had before snaked through her as they got out of the car. He started up the stairs first, and she followed. At the top, he opened the door and flipped on the light. She followed him in, her gaze taking in every detail of the room. Clean and neat, just like him. At the kitchen counter, he grabbed a phone book and paged through it. "You got any one you like in particular?" She shrugged. "It doesn't matter." After a minute more of searching, Greg reached for the phone, dialed the number, and placed the call. When the cab was on its way, he turned to her. "Would you like something to drink? I don't have much. Water, milk, beer?" She scrunched her nose and shook her head. "No, thanks." Greg nodded, and Maggie was pretty sure he already knew what her answer would be when he asked. He walked over to where she was standing, looking like each step might be his last. "I had fun tonight, just so you know." Her smile was genuine. "So did I." His gaze dropped between them. "Really? I mean, I really felt bad about Tracy and her being so rude to you." "No, hey, don't worry about it. I lived. It's okay." When he looked at her, Maggie's gaze was swept up in his. Between them, his fingers brushed hers, and before she knew it, he leaned toward her. It wasn't what she'd expected. Why, she didn't know, but somehow him being a nice guy who would call a cab with no pressure and then kiss her before she left wasn't where she thought this night would go. His lips brushed hers, but only that. It was nicer than she thought it would be. Her eyes came open, and she looked up to find him gazing right through her. "Can I call you sometime?" Her heart had no other answer. "I'd like that." The cab ride back was eternal, and Maggie had to fight not to fall asleep the whole way. Once at the estate, she paid the driver more than she had thought it would be, and then slipped from the cab and around to the back. Quietly, she let herself in the kitchen door. Inez had carefully gotten her the message that she would leave it open. Up the stairs and to her bedroom door she went, but when she was there, she couldn't just go in without checking. Softly she slipped to Izzy's door and opened it. The child in the baby bed was barely visible, yet she looked older than Maggie remembered. "Good night, little one." Then across the hall to Peter's room. He was curled in a ball, his thumb in his mouth. A question went through Maggie's mind at his posture, but then she thought rationally she'd never actually seen him in the middle of the night before. Softly, she kissed her fingers. "Good night, sweet prince. I love you." And she tiptoed out. 5.5 hours later, Maggie was up again. Over and over she stifled the yawns, but she was determined not to let her one day off hurt her job performance. It was back to lessons and lunches, and although the night before had been a nice distraction, this was life. The day slipped by almost without notice. She was so in tune with the schedule, it was like it had never been a problem. Even Patty Ann almost smiled when they were down at the dining room door at 5:45, cleaned, pressed, and ready. Dinner went well, although Mr. Ayer was not present. Maggie considered asking about that, but she didn't have the courage. Mrs. Ayer mostly ate in silence, and although Maggie wanted to say something to her, she couldn't think what that something should be. When dinner was finished, Maggie had Peter kiss his mother, and they went upstairs to take baths. Isabella went through first, and her new favorite word seemed to be geeky. It was cute to hear her say it over and over, but Maggie was afraid the others would throw a fit if they heard, So in her best interest, she knelt by the tub, washing off the slick little body. Say, Mommy. Yeah, Mommy. She held her lips just right on the M part of Mommy to demonstrate the letter. Mommy. Kiki, Isabella squealed excitedly. No, Maggie laughed. Mommy. Mommy. Kiki. Well, I guess Mommy is going to have to wait till tomorrow. She grabbed a towel and dried the first little one off. Okay, Mister, your turn. Like the trooper he was, Peter stepped forward. Maggie took hold of his shirt and pulled it up. His pants were halfway down when she noticed the dark brown circles on the back of his arm. Peter, what happened? Concern drained through her as she gazed at him. Did you fall? Slowly, side to side, his head moved, but his gaze was on the tile. What? Maggie turned him to the other side, and there were identical marks on his other arm. Gently, she turned him to face her. Peter, who did this to you? He wouldn't look at her. You can tell me. I won't be mad. Maggie's mind was flying through every bit of training she'd ever had on how to get a child to tell you something they didn't want to tell you. Izzy cried, Peter said softly. I tried to tell her to stop. Izzy? Maggie's gaze went to the baby playing with a towel on the floor. She surveyed the child in one glance. Was she hurt? No. She got in trouble. I tried to tell her to stop. What did she get into trouble for? Every point in Maggie's body was in full defense and concern mode. Peter didn't say anything, and Maggie realized the intensity of her voice was scaring him. She forced herself to calm down and breathe. It's okay, Peter. Really. You can tell me. She was trying to climb the ladder on the playhouse. The words came slow and deliberately. Miss Haga got mad. It was all she could do to keep her emotions from reaching the surface. Did she hit Izzy? Peter's head moved back and forth. Did she hit you? Again, his head moved back and forth. Peter, this is important. Did Miss Haga hurt you? His head stopped, and he stood there staring at the tiles. Maggie's heart had ceased beating. It's okay, Peter. I won't get mad. I promise. She wanted me to be quiet because I was telling Izzy to stop crying. Maggie's intensity felt like it might overwhelm her. Still, she forced herself to calm down so she could put her hand gently on his back without scaring him. Peter, did she hurt you? When he looked at her, there were tears welling in his brown eyes. She shook me real hard. I told her I was sorry, but she was really mad. I tried to tell her. Oh, baby boy. And Maggie pulled him into her arms, wishing she had never heard of such a thing as a day off. Chapter 13. Keith had tried every excuse he could think of to get out of going to the Woodlands, but neither Dallas nor Ike would hear any of it. His future was calling, and there didn't seem like much he could do to get out of it. This house is so perfect, Dallas cooed from her side of the pickup. She looked so strange sitting there, so out of place. Keith tried not to think about who looked better sitting there. It wasn't easy. Do you think we should just put an offer in now, or should we try to haggle with them? Dallas asked. Why don't we just see the house first, and then we'll decide. Put it off. That was his motto. Put it off until the very last possible moment. It was the best he could think to do. We're going over to the stables, Maggie said to Inez Wednesday afternoon. I talked to Jeffrey. He said he would come get us and take us over there. You're going riding? Inez asked with concern. Horses, Isabella said. I don't know. We'll see. The kids need some fresh air. There's fresh air in the backyard. Yeah, but there's not horses. Maggie shot the maid a grin. Horses. With Peter's hand in hers and Isabella planted on her hip, Maggie stepped from the gardener's truck, scanning the area for the Dodge. "You want me to wait for you?" Jeffrey asked. "No, that's okay. If they're not here, we'll wait." He didn't look particularly pleased about that, but he nodded and drove off. In the dust cloud that followed, Maggie stepped, hoping this was the right thing to do. Maybe together they could figure out what to do about Ms. Haga and the little Marks. Holding on to both children, she walked into the breezeway of the stables, where she listened with every step for voices, but heard nothing. At the door to the office, she knocked. A minute she waited, then she knocked again. "Hello? Anyone here?" She ducked into the office, which felt good compared with the stifling humidity of outside. "Hello? Keith? Ike?" Still nothing. She glanced back through the breezeway outside. No movement anywhere. Finally, she made the decision. "Come on, looks like we're going to have to wait." An hour slid by as Maggie held Isabella, who played for a little while, then fell asleep. There didn't seem to be a good place to lay her down, so Maggie willed her arm not to drop off as she held the sleeping child, who got heavier by the minute. "When is Keith going to get here?" Peter asked, clearly losing his patience as well. "Soon, I hope." At that moment her ears picked up the voices in the breezeway, and she froze. Too late to make a new decision, she sat unmoving as the two figures walked into the office. Ike was all the way in the room before he realized she was there and stopped. His smile at her wasn't altogether happy. "Ms. Montgomery, this is a surprise." She stood, praying she could get all the way up without falling. "I'm sorry, we were waiting for Keith." Puzzlement ripped through Ike's gaze. "Keith? Keith went to the Woodlands with Dallas." Ike walked through the office to his desk as a young man, several years younger than Maggie, followed him in. At the desk, the two talked in quiet tones as Ike handed out the rest of the day's work schedule. The young man turned to go, and at the door tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am?" Maggie stood there, not sure if she should sit or run. She nodded to the young man, who ducked out. "Ms. Montgomery, why are you here?" Ike leaned back in his office chair and surveyed her from head to foot. She pulled herself up to her full height. I need to talk with Keith." "Keith. Well, let me give you a little piece of advice about Keith Ayer. Mr. Ayer is not available for your entertainment or your amusement, no matter what you may have been led to believe." His disdain for her dripped from the statement. "Now, I don't know what fancy ideas he might have put in your head about things, but let's get one thing perfectly straight, shall we? He's engaged, and chasing after engaged men just doesn't make it very far on the sniff factor around here. Now, I advise you to go back up to the mansion and stay there. I don't want to see you hanging around the stables again, because you're just not welcome down here. Got it?" How she kept from crying, Maggie would never know. Her pride hurt, her arm hurt, her heart hurt. Everything about her hurt, including her overwhelming desire to help the children. She wanted to tell him that, to tell him this was only about them. Instead, she resettled Isabella on her shoulder and squared her jaw. He was just like all the rest of them, condescending and spiteful. "Yeah, I got it. I'm sorry for taking up your time." She grabbed Peter's hand and stumbled from the office, not knowing where she was going or how she was going to get there. Tears blurred her vision so that she wasn't sure she was even going in the right direction, but stopping wasn't an option. Out into the sun they went, through the dust and out to the road. Her tears, hot and salty, slid down her cheeks. "Ma'am!" The word barely slowed her down. "Ma'am, if you want a ride, I could take you," the young man from the office said. Maggie yanked the tears back into her eyes and turned to him as he ran up to her. "Oh, okay. Thank you. That would be great." It was Friday before Keith managed to make it to the stables again, There was just something about Dallas that made him feel guilty if he wasn't entertaining her at every moment. He walked into the office at 8 o'clock and grabbed the feed schedule from the wall. No doubt he was going to get ribbed for missing 2 days in a row. "Well, the dead has arisen," Ike said as he and Tanner came into the office. "Nice of you to join us again." Yeah, Keith said, shrugging off the teasing. "I'm going to go check the hay out in the stables." "Good plan," Ike said, and waved him out. "It would be good for you to get something accomplished this week." With a push out of the office, Keith strode through the stables, looking in to check each horse individually as he did every morning. He was really going to miss this morning ritual when he was chained to some desk in a few months. "Good morning, Dragnet. You're up mighty early." He rubbed a hand over the chestnut's head. The office door banged, and he looked up. "Y'all all ready to head out for tomorrow?" Keith asked the retreating back of the young cowboy who would presumably take his place once he was gone. "Oh!" Tanner spun on the heel of his boot. "Mr. Ayer, I didn't see you there." "Sorry." Keith came abreast of him, and they started out. "Anything exciting happen while I was gone?" Tanner, never one to be quick on the draw with words, hesitated. He glanced back at the office door, and then swung his gaze forward again. Even as he walked, it took another long moment for him to say anything. "Well, there was one thing." Nothing in Keith liked the hesitation or the glance. "Why? What happened?" "Well," Tanner glanced back again. "Mr. Jones would kill me if he knew I told you this." "Well, Mr. Jones doesn't own this place. What do you say you tell me and let me decide?" "Well," it seemed to take a tug of his courage to get the words out. "The other day, when you were gone, the lady who works at the mansion came by." "The lady?" Keith was having trouble picturing Patty Ann anywhere near the stables. "Yeah, the young one with the nice hair. She had the 2 kids with her." Instantly, Keith was worried. "Maggie? Maggie was here?" Tanner nodded. "Why? What did she want? What did she say?" "I don't know," Tanner shrugged, shrinking back from the weight of responsibility. "Mr. Jones talked to her, and when she left, she was real upset. I think she was going to walk all the way back with them kids, but I took her back so she wouldn't have to walk." The story twisted and twined through Keith as his brain fought to decide what to do with it. "You don't know what she and Mr. Jones talked about?" "No, sir. I just know she was real upset when I took her home." Keith nodded. "Well, thanks for telling me, Tanner. You did good. I hope she's not in trouble. She really seems like a nice lady." "That she is, Tanner. That she is." The Dodge pulled to the front of the mansion in a small cloud of dust. Keith hopped out and slammed the door. He stalked to the front door. He needed to know what was going on. Had he been thinking, he would have come up with a less intrusive way to find out. However, he wasn't thinking. Not about shoulds and protocol, anyway. His only concern was about her, and that thought overtook every other one. At the door, he didn't ring the doorbell, but he was met by Inez just the same. "Where's Maggie?" Inez looked positively terrified. "Miss Montgomery? I think she's upstairs. Why?" "Keith." His father's voice rumbled through the entire mansion. "I need to see you." "I'm not here on business, Dad." "Keith." The name was harsh and sharp. "I need to see you now." Loathing for his whole insufferable life crawled through Keith. "Fine, but this better be quick." He stalked to his father's office, entered, and shut the door. Something told him he didn't want the entire mansion privy to this little discussion. His father walked around the desk, but didn't sit down. "I got a call this morning." Keith wasn't interested in playing cat and mouse. "And?" "It was from Bill Hodges." He let the name hang in the air for a moment. "He said somebody had canceled his contract without notice, and he said we owe him for the remainder of the contract as scheduled, whether we accept the deliveries or not." Anger boiled in Keith's gut. "First of all, you told me to make a decision. I made it. Second of all, we don't owe him a dime. In fact, We paid for 3 loads that were either late or partial shipments. In my books, that means if anything, he owes us. Tell Bill Hodges he's off his rocker if he thinks I'm going to deal with someone who jerks me around and then says it's my fault. I'll have you know that Bill is a friend of mine." Keith was in no mood to coddle. "Then I suggest you pick your friends a little better." He turned for the door. His father sounded like he was about to explode as he cleared his throat. "Have you told Dallas about the other night?" "The other night?" It took him a moment to frame the reference even as he stopped. Slowly he turned. "You mean Friday? No. Why would I tell her about that?" "Because, Keith, you're not in college anymore, and you're not in high school. You can't go around cavorting with drunkards and expect your wife-to-be to never find out about it." "Dad, I'm almost 30 years old. I'm not 16. I can drink if I want to." "You're not hearing me, Keith. Responsible adults do not stay out all night and come home plastered. You have to get your priorities in order here. Dallas and her family can't have bad publicity over some stupid thing you did." "I had a few drinks. That's not a crime." "Make no mistake about this. You get stopped in the shape you were in the other night, and jail is going to look good compared to the hell you will reap from that family. And let me tell you, Lowell Henderson is not one to forgive easily when his name's at stake." Keith's patience with his father was about to run out, but he held it in 2 fists just the same. "You don't have to tell me about Lowell Henderson. I've seen him work up close and personal. Now, if you'll excuse me—" "Don't you dare make a mistake with this one." His father's menacing tone snaked through Keith. "Dallas deserves better." That did it. He turned in one swing. "For the love of Mike, Dad, what do you want from me? Huh? What? I've done every single thing you've ever asked. Private school, college, master's degree, and now I'm marrying Dallas Henderson. I'm moving away to a house that's 6 times too big and 10 times too expensive. I'm getting a job at a desk that I'm going to hate just so maybe you'll finally get off my back about not being good enough. And now you're going to stand there and tell me even this much isn't enough? What am I supposed to do? Cut my wrist and bleed so you'll see I'm trying to make this work?" Hurt laced through him, and he hated that. "I don't know why you don't just say what you're really thinking and get it over with. I'm a disappointment. I have been from day one, and if you could ship me back to the factory and order a new son, you would do it in a heartbeat." "Keith, you're blowing this out of proportion." "Out of proportion?" Hurt snapped into raging anger. "This is my life we're talking about here, Dad. I am sorry I'm not more rational, but I'm kind of dealing with a mountain of junk at the moment." He shook his head. "I don't have to stand here and listen to this." "I've decided to put Ike in charge at the stables," his father said, as Keith stepped out of the door. Keith turned very, very slowly. Hurt, anger, resentment, and complete exasperation reigned through him. He wanted to scream and yell, but he knew how little that would accomplish. Finally, he shrugged. "Well, it's your operation. It always has been. In 2 months, I'm out of here for good anyway. Do whatever you want with it." And without waiting for his father's reply, he stomped out. At the front door, he came a breath away from going out. Then he remembered his original mission, and he turned back for the stairs. 2 at a time, he climbed them, not caring if it was proper or not. He didn't really care about anything at the moment. They didn't care about him. Why should he care about them? At the top, he didn't so much as pause as he headed to the playroom. When he got to the door, he stopped for 1 second and listened. Instantly, peace and serenity drifted through everything else. He smiled at the lilt in her voice and the happy sounds of the kids. He would have given the world to have what they had now. Quietly, he pushed open the door and peered inside. She sat in the chair with Izzy on her lap, reading. It was a scene he wished he could get very used to. "Maggie," he whispered, and her head jerked up. Her eyes went wide. "Keith? What?" He put his finger to his lips and ducked into the room. The closer to her he got, the more his lungs screamed for air. It was like being sucked into a black hole of exhilarated anticipation. "How's it going?" He sat down on his heel next to the rocking chair. Unconsciously, he ran his thumb under his nose. "I heard you came by the stables the other day." The depth of Maggie's agony had never reached so low. He was here, and yet he wasn't. Tears jumped into her skull, stinging everything in their path. Ike's words rang in her head, and as much as she wanted it not to be true, he was right. This was Keith Ayer, and she needed to remember that. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I just thought maybe we could go riding, that's all." Keith's face fell into concern. "Tanner said he thought you were upset." It took everything she had to shake her head and smile. "I just thought, I wasn't thinking. You have enough to do without us coming around to bother you." "Bother me? What does that mean? You haven't been bothering me. I love having you all out there." That makes one of you, she thought, but she was smart enough to know voicing it would be disastrous. "I know, but you have work to do." He shook his head at that, and his jaw went hard. "Yeah, work." Concern plowed through her on his tone. Her gaze surveyed him. "What does that mean?" "Nothing." He looked at her and smiled. "Listen, okay, you three are welcome at the stables any time you want to come." He reached over and ran his hand down Isabella's curls. "I love seeing you." Maggie nodded, but she knew better. She had seen reality in bright, living, unforgettable color. "Are you sure that's all?" He looked like he wanted her to say everything that was in her heart. He was so close, so unbearably close. She was afraid she just might. "Yeah, what else would there be?" "What did you say to Maggie?" Keith asked, slamming the office door behind him. He was itching for a fight, and Ike was as good a place to start as any. "Maggie." Ike stood and went to the filing cabinet. "I'd say you have more to worry about than some little gold digger like her." Fury overtook him in a breath, and Keith grabbed Ike by the perfectly pressed shirt and slammed him up against the wall. "What did you say to her?" Ike's eyes went ice cold. "You're something else, you know that? You've got Dallas Henderson staying in your house, presumably in your bed, and you're all hot and bothered about some little kid's babysitter. You say one more thing like that about her, and I swear—" "Look, Keith." Ike pulled calm to him as he put up his hands to show he wasn't about to take the first swing. "I know you're freaked out about the wedding. I get that. I can't say I wouldn't be either. But get serious here. You just got demoted from owner to employee, and now you're worried about this?" "He called already, huh?" Keith backed up. The world seemed to be crashing around him. "Yes, he did. I've told you he doesn't take kindly to anyone undermining him." "Undermining? Whoa, now just hold it right there. You agreed with me about the Hodges thing." "Yes, I did. I still do. But your dad doesn't know that, and so he will take out his displeasure on whoever's name is stamped at the bottom of the order. Besides, this way he can tell Hodges he's taken care of the problem." The word snarled around Keith's gut. Ike put his hand on Keith's back, which to Keith wasn't the smartest move anyone had ever made. "Listen to me, Keith. You've got like 2 months left here, tops. Just lay low and keep yourself out of trouble. The less he hears from you, the better. Trust me, in 2 months you'll be married and far, far away from this place and from him. None of this will even be on the table anymore." Keith turned, and the ice from Ike's eyes had descended into Keith's heart. "What makes you think then will be any better than now?" As far into the future as he could see, life had no prospect of getting any better than it was at this very moment. "I've got Hay to check." We're leaving at noon. I expect you to take care of everything while we're gone," Ike called. "Yeah," Keith walked out. "What else is new?" Sitting at the counter over a ham sandwich and chips, Keith reran the morning through his mind. Ike had said something to her. Of that, Keith had no doubt. But what had he said? How low had he sunk to convince her to stay away? His thoughts traveled back to the party on Monday. Tracy cut Maggie to ribbons, and Maggie never so much as swung back. He wondered if that's what she was doing now, ducking back and hoping to become invisible so no one would see how hurt she really was. The thought sent an ache through his heart that he wondered if he'd ever before felt. She was hurting, and there wasn't one single solitary thing he could see to do about it. "Hey, babe," Dallas said, coming in from the garage with a fistful of packages. "I didn't expect you to be here." "Lunchtime." Sheikah thunked the packages onto the counter. "Oh, hey, Dad called today. He's got an interview set up for you in 2 weeks with Mr. Farrell at Devonshire. He said to emphasize your education and to go easy on the last 5 years." Dallas walked up and ate a chip from Keith's plate. "What else did he say?" "Just that he and Mom will be coming up to Vermont again for graduation. You are remembering graduation, aren't you? May 13. You've got your flight booked and everything?" She ate another chip. He hadn't even thought about it. "Oh, I was going to do that this week." She didn't look pleased with the answer. "You need to get that booked. You're going to have to pay triple if you wait too long." Like she'd ever thought money was a problem for him before. "Or, I guess you could take your dad's private plane up there." That thought seemed to appeal to her as she crunched another chip. "That way, we could just fly back together. Yeah, why don't you just do that?" Yeah, why didn't he? Chapter 14. "Please make note of the party next Saturday," Patty Ann said, pointing it out on Maggie's schedule. The personal secretary's office in the East Wing was so dark and gloomy, Maggie had to make herself not shiver at the looming doom that seemed to glare at her from the corners. Worse, it was cold. Ice block cold. "Okay." "Mrs. Ayer does not want the children around that night. Nowhere. No how." That stopped Maggie's nodding. "Where are we supposed to go?" "The playroom is acceptable, but stay out of sight and absolutely no noise. This is a very important affair. Many of Mr. Ayer's biggest business associates will be in attendance." Maggie scratched the side of her head. "Okay." "Mr. and Mrs. Ayer are due to fly out this evening to attend her nephew's wedding on Tuesday." "Tuesday? Who gets married on a Tuesday?" "Those," Patty Ann said with exasperation in her voice, "who can afford to be married in a private ceremony in Buenos Aires." "Ah." Maggie lifted her chin in understanding. "That's all you need to be aware of. Everything else is self-explanatory." Meeting over, Maggie stood. "Oh, and Ms. Montgomery, your paycheck." At least that was getting to be a nice habit. "May 13, Dallas said, pulling Keith to her as they stood in the terminal. Her eyes danced with the date. "Get that jet fired up. I'll be waiting to see you." "I wouldn't miss it." His hand felt big on her waist. Where had the "I can't wait to be with you" feelings he'd had when they first got together gone? Now it was like going through the motions with someone he didn't even know, and as he stood there with her, he wondered if he had ever really known her, or if he had been in love with the idea of being in love with her. She kissed him once more. It was more of a peck, really. "And don't forget to call the bank on that house loan like we talked about." "Got it." "Oh, and I'll email you the details on the Farrell thing once Dad sends them to me." Keith nodded. "I'll be watching for it." He couldn't figure out why she didn't just get on the plane already. She stopped and gazed right into his eyes. I love you. He tried to smile. Love you. Final boarding call, Flight 85 to New Haven. Dallas looked up at the speakers. That's me, she sighed. I hate leaving you. You take care of yourself. She readjusted his collar. You too. I love you, babe. Love you too. With one more kiss, he glanced beyond her to the boarding ramp. You'd better get, or you're going to miss your plane. Okay. She pulled herself away from him and turned. Bye. He waved. Take care. He smiled. I love you. And then, finally, mercifully, she was gone. Keith let his eyes go closed as he breathed in what it was like not to have to be somebody else to impress her. Sooner or later, she was going to see the truth, and sooner or later she was not going to be happy about that truth. The only question was just how long, sooner or later, would take to get here. Ms. Montgomery, phone call, Inez said that evening when the kids were down for the count. Maggie swung her legs off her bed and followed the maid down the stairs and into the kitchen. Thanks. Inez nodded, snapped off the light, and left. Dallas was gone. Maggie knew this because she'd heard Inez and Jeffrey talking about it. All day long, she had hoped Keith might make an unscheduled appearance, yet he never had. Hello? Maggie, oh good, I'm glad I caught you. Greg? Her heart fell through the name. You remembered. Of course I remembered. You have such little faith in my memory. What's up? I was thinking we should get together again. Maybe tomorrow night? What do you say? Oh, Greg. She sat down on the chair in the breakfast nook. I don't know. The Ayers are gone, and I have no idea when I'll get another day off, but it definitely won't be tomorrow. Nights? You don't even have nights off? Not really. Her mind tripped back over the little bruises that had faded from everything but her memory. If it was up to her, she would never have so much as another minute off. That sounds like slave labor. She sighed. It's not so bad. He seemed to think through their options, which, from Maggie's point of view, didn't seem exactly abundant. Well, you're free now, to talk, I mean. Yeah. Softness for him drifted through her. I'm free to talk now. I'll take it. His parents were gone. Keith knew that. Dallas was also safely back in Vermont. He knew that because she had called when she got there. Sunday morning was his first chance, and he wasn't going to blow this one. He stood on the front steps, pressed and ready for church. All he wanted was to spend a couple of hours with the only person who still represented sanity in his world. He rang the doorbell, and nerves crashed through him. What if she told him no? What if she laughed in his face? He reached to ring it again when Inez opened the door. Mr. Ayer? Inez. He ducked, knowing she could as easily as not close the door in his face. His hands found his pants pocket. Is Miss Montgomery here? Confusion slid over her face. Yes, I think she's upstairs. With his head tilted, he looked at her. Do you mind? It took a breath, but she opened the door wider. Go on. You're an angel, Inez. Yeah, well, they'll strip my wings if they find you here, so be careful. The thought of church always brought with it a pang of guilt and a pang of regret. Maggie wished she could load the kids into the little Chevette and no one would know, but there was fat chance of that happening. God, I hope you know I would be there if I could. A soft knock sounded on the door, and she looked up. Joy jumped through her, followed immediately by painful indifference. Keith. Hey, you guys busy? He was in his un-Keith outfit again, nice pants, a button-down white cotton shirt that revealed a solid gold chain at his neck. It made her think of Dallas, which made her heart fall even further. No, come on in. What's up? He sat down Indian style on the carpet in front of her. We're learning our letters. She pointed to another one.
P,
Peter said with no trouble. And what starts with P? She asked.
Peter,
He said jubilantly, and she held up her hand for him to slap. Very nice. Keith beamed his approval, which Peter obviously soaked up. For her part, Maggie couldn't look at Keith. It just hurt too much. Listen, Keith said, and his gaze drifted over her. She hated the way he looked at her because it always made her think she was doing something wrong by being with him. I was going to go into church. I wondered if y'all wanted to come with me. Her gaze jumped to his, and he smiled softly. I don't know. She looked at her watch. We don't have much time. I can't get the kids and me ready that fast. Then you get you ready, and I'll get them ready. He stood from the floor and reached down for her hand. Maggie put her hand in his, and gently he pulled her up. When she was standing only a foot from him, the scent of his cologne invaded her senses, and she fought not to get lost in it. You sure? Positive. There was no other place Keith was meant to be other than right there in that little church holding Isabella with Peter between them. His heart filled his chest as he watched Maggie show Peter how to fold his hands and how to bow his head. He wanted only for her arms to be wrapped around him as easily as she wrapped Peter under her wing and guided him through his prayers. So many things would have been so very different about Keith's life had that one night not happened. He could see in Maggie all the things he had missed when his mother had died: a calm hand to guide him, a compassionate heart to shield him from the cold, harsh world, a way of peace in an unstable, volatile existence. That's all he now prayed for, some way to find what Maggie so effortlessly gave to Peter. Keith let his gaze trail to the front. God, I'm asking here. I don't know how to do this. I see how she is, and I know I want that. But everything is so messed up. Dad's furious, my job's in the gutter. I don't even know if I want to be with Dallas anymore. Nothing is making sense anymore. Nothing. The congregation sat, and Keith sat with them, resting Isabella on his knee. The little girl snuggled into his chest and stuck her thumb in her mouth. Just to stay here. He would have settled for that. People talk about discerning God's will in their lives, the preacher said. They talk about not being sure what will find them favor in God's eyes. In Psalms 37:4 and 5, it says, Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. To understand this verse, you must first get hold of what the word desire means. Desire is made up of two parts, de, meaning of, and sire, meaning the Father. So, desire literally means of the Father. Contrast this with what we often think desire means: our wants, our needs, our plans. That's not what it means at all. The sermon had Keith's attention, and he shifted slightly in concentration. When the scripture says he will provide you with the desires of your heart, that means that he will provide you with what he knows you really need, those things that he has put in your heart. Now, what happens a lot of times is we have what seem to be competing desires, two things that are tugging us in different directions. This is where the question of discernment comes in. My best advice on this subject is to walk through the doors that he opens for you and stop pounding on the doors that are locked. You may think that door number 2 will lead you to everything you've ever wanted. So you try it, and when you find it locked, it doesn't work out, or roadblocks seem to drop from the sky, so you start pounding on that door. Many people pray asking for what they want to have happen. But God, he pointed upward, God in his infinite wisdom knows that door will ultimately lead you to heartache and pain. So he chooses to keep it locked for your sake. But if you're like me, you just know that whatever's on the other side of that door will lead you to what you want. And so you will pound and kick and bang on that door, sure that it will lead you to what you want. And if you're like me, you might even get mad at God for not opening that door. God, please, if you'll just let it work out this way. No. He stopped, his face intense. No, that's not going for the desires of our hearts. That's not walking in His ways. That's walking in our own ways and asking God to bless it. He won't. No, God will never bless what He doesn't instigate. Why? Because He will not bless what is not from Himself. So, what's the answer to this dilemma? How do we know what God wants us to do? Simple. You walk through the doors that are open. Quit banging on the ones He has closed. Ask Him to lead you and to guide you and to open up those doors you are supposed to walk through. Then, as the doors open before you, you will know that you are in God's will for your life. And when you get to a door that is locked, know deep down that He locked it for a reason. You may not be able to see that reason right at this moment, but He has your ultimate best in mind, and if you let Him, He will guide you to your ultimate best. The preacher stepped away from the pulpit. Let us stand. Keith stood, but the sermon was on loop in his brain. Walk through the doors that are open. Stop banging on those that are closed. He felt like he'd been banging his whole life, banging to get his father's approval, banging to feel whole again, banging to get someone to notice him, just for him. God, He makes it sound so easy, but it feels so hard. Please help me to know which doors it makes sense for me to go through. I've never needed anything more in my life. When they got back to the mansion after church, Maggie couldn't get out of the pickup fast enough. His presence was threatening to overload every no circuit she had. Gentle and kind, He was right there the second she needed anything, carrying kids, helping them in, smiling at her in that way that curled her toes. It was starting to frazzle her nerves. Hey, why don't you leave the car seats in, go change, and we'll go riding? Keith asked when Maggie started to remove the car seat from the Dodge. That slammed her to a stop. Today? He tilted his head to the side. I'm off. Y'all don't have lessons. Come on, what do you say? It'll be fun. No. Her head screamed so loud she thought it would explode. The only problem was, it wasn't her head that had the controls anymore. Okay. Y'all good? Keith asked Maggie as she sat on Nell with Izzy in front of her. Great. How one simple word could make his heart pound, he had no idea. He swung Peter up and then got on Buck. Reins in hand, he turned them and headed out to the waterfall. He hadn't exactly told her where they would be going, but he didn't think she would mind. Just a couple hours to be sane, and then he would find a way to deal with a headache of his life. To say the falls were breathtaking would have been an understatement. Maggie had the distinct impression that heaven couldn't be as gorgeous. However, what really stole her breath away was the once again scruffy cowboy riding in front of her. He had traded in his pressed white cotton button-down for a green and gray plaid shirt with the sleeves ripped off. Coupled with the bandana and the cowboy hat, Maggie knew she was in for a full day of trying not to stare. How'd you do? Keith asked as he stood at her feet waiting to help her off the horse. Great. Maggie handed Isabella down and then swung her own leg over and off. She felt him standing behind her, his hand out lest she stumble. I can take her. She reached for Isabella. Come here, you.
Kiki!
Isabella squealed happily, and Maggie didn't miss Keith's heart-stopping smile. I think you've found another fan. Maggie smiled, took Peter's hand, and they walked over to the shade of the tree near the second shelf of rock. It was so unbelievably peaceful out here, like the rest of the world didn't exist. She sat down and set Isabella on the soft, cool grass beside her. Instantly, Isabella rolled, crawled, and then stood. She toddled off just as Keith walked up and swept her up in his arms. "Where do you think you're going, Missy?" He blew on her belly and then lowered himself to the ground as she giggled appreciatively. Maggie fell back onto the grass herself. "Oh, I could live out here." Keith stood Isabella on the grass as Peter sat down next to Maggie. "You and me both." Keith breathed in the day. "Just that sound." "It's enough to put you to sleep." She let herself drift away on the lilting splashes of the falls. A yawn danced through her. She hadn't been this truly relaxed in longer than she could remember. Every muscle, every thought. The soft breeze blew a curl across her face, and she brushed it aside. "I think I could go to sleep right here." "So, go to sleep." Her eyes came open and she laughed at him. "I'm on duty, remember?" "Well, I for one think you could stand to take an hour off." He picked up Isabella, who was climbing all over him. "Go to sleep. I'll take care of them." The offer was too good to be true, she thought as another yawn attacked her. If Greg hadn't kept her up so late talking, it might not be such a struggle to stay awake now. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Relax. I've got this." It was as if 2 seconds after he'd suggested it, Maggie was asleep. She had rolled to the side, taken her glasses off, and curled up with her face lying on her hand. As he played quietly with the kids, Keith watched her. She was beautiful, especially minus the glasses. They threw harsh lines over a face that was anything but harsh. He wondered about them, and about the car, and about the clothes. It was as if more than the bare minimum meant she had asked for too much. His thoughts traced to Dallas and over how different they were. It wasn't that Dallas was a bad person exactly, more that she was shallow in ways he couldn't even adequately explain. Even the college education was about how much money she could make with it, rather than about following her heart's desire. Isabella had long since settled into the crook of his arm, and she too was dozing. He looked down at her, and the thought came to him that this was it, his heart's desire, to have a family, raise them, be there for them, hold them at night, tuck them in. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He glanced over at Maggie, and his thoughts traced to Dallas. Sure, he knew about her dreams of the house and the cars and the jobs. But what about her deeper dreams? What about what she really wanted? Gazing at Maggie, he knew that complicating her life by pursuing her wasn't fair. She was happy where she was, and it was clear from the party that she would never be happy where he had to be. Still, when he looked down into the now sleeping eyes of the child in his arms, he couldn't help but wish that things could be so, so different. A life with Maggie, simple and honest, family and a few friends. He shook his head at those thoughts. It would never happen, and he was setting himself up for more heartache by thinking that it could. When she woke up, Keith was sitting with his back to the tree, holding Isabella and taking a nap of his own. She reached over and pulled her glasses on, making as little noise as possible. It was nice to have this chance just to watch him. He looked so peaceful and content. Next to his thigh laid Peter. The three of them made a picture she knew she would remember forever. It occurred to her then what a good older brother he was, and in almost the same thought, what a good dad he would make someday. Strong and sure, gentle and loving. Dallas was one lucky woman. Maggie's heart panged at the thought. At that moment he stirred and opened his eyes. His smile was slow, but obvious. "How long have you been awake?" "Few minutes. You have a good nap?" He took a long breath. "Yeah." He leaned his head first one way, then the other to get the kinks out. "Ooh, I haven't done that in a while." His gaze found hers, and there was no awkwardness anywhere to be seen. I take it things are going good at the mansion?" She shrugged. The thought of telling him about Peter crossed her mind, but she crossed it off again instantly. There was nothing he could do, and getting him in the middle of it was pointless. Okay. She rolled onto her back so she was looking up at the sky. Keep the kids occupied and out of sight. That's about the extent of it. There was no response, and she let her head fall to the side so she could look at him. She brushed an errant strand from her face. "So, did you get put in the closet for parties when you were little, too?" Confusion traced across his face. "In the closet?" "Yeah, like, we don't want to hear from them or see them no matter what." She deepened her voice in emphasis. His face fell in concern. "Did they tell you that?" She rolled to her stomach. "Basically. Apparently, they are having some ultra-important party next Saturday. I think Patty Ann may lock us in the playroom to keep us from ruining it. I just hope she doesn't throw away the key." Maggie laughed at her own joke. However, Keith wasn't laughing. "They're banishing you?" "Banishing. Yep, I'd say that's a pretty good word for it." She picked up a blade of grass and twisted it through her fingers. Then she rolled back onto her back. "It could be worse. We could be invited, like last time." There was a long pause during which the only sound was the waterfall. "Or you could escape altogether," he said softly. That brought her around to look at him. Escape? Yeah, right. They'd have my head. "Not if they knew where you were escaping to," he smiled. She was intrigued and just a little more than concerned. "Such as?" "My place." The suggestion smashed through her, and Maggie shook her head, sending the strands of hair spiraling through the breeze. "No, you don't want us. Besides, how would I put the kids to bed?" He shrugged, and it brought her attention to his sleek, tanned arms. "I have 2 extra rooms that nobody uses. We could put Izzy on the floor, Peter in the bed. You could take the room right next to them." The words were like a torrent, one coming as fast as his light southern drawl would let them. "Y'all could come over early. We could make supper, watch a movie." Hold on." She waved her hands to get him to stop. Then she pulled up to her knees. "You're not serious?" But he never wavered. "Yes, I am. Please, Maggie, please, let me do this for you." It was the epitome of stupid. "You sure you won't mind?" "No way. I think it will be fun." Chapter 15. Keith grabbed the phone on the 3rd ring. "This is Keith." "Hey, dude, are you not picking up your messages again? What is up with you and not returning my calls? You're going to give me a complex if you don't watch it," Greg said with a laugh. "Not my fault. Some of us have to work," Keith said, shifting his cell phone to his other ear as he hauled a slab of hay through the stables to Dragnet's stall. "What are you up to?" "Numbers, clients, problems. Same as always. You?" "Horses, hay, problems. Same as always." He threw the hay over the gate and stopped only a second to pat the horse. "Haven't heard from you in a while." "Aren't you lucky?" "Hey, you said it, not me." "I guess you got Dallas to the airport and back home in one piece." "You know me, Mr. Responsibility," Keith said, dragging 2 more slabs off the bale of hay. "Seems that part comes and goes as I remember." "Oh, uh-huh. Hello, Pot. This is the kettle calling." He slung those slabs over the gate to Buck. "Well, you may have a point there," Greg said. "Considering I got driven home the other night, that might not be too far from the truth." "Driven home? When?" "The other night," Greg said, as if Keith already knew. "After your party." Keith stopped and leaned against the graying wood of the stables. He took his hat off and wiped his forehead. "After the party? What are you talking about? Who drove you home?" There was a pause. "Well, if you must know, Maggie took me home." Even the hat stopped. Maggie? A picture of her lying in the afternoon sun traced through him. Why did Maggie take you home? I don't know. She didn't trust me to drive, I guess. She took you all the way into Houston? Panic rose in him with each question. That's where my home is. I know that. Why did you make her drive you back? If you didn't think you could drive, you should have asked me. Hey, dude, I didn't make the decision. She did. And believe me, I wasn't going to go back up to your door and ask you to take me at that point. Keith thought back to that night, trying to remember if Greg had been that bad off. Surely he would have noticed if he was. Then the thought occurred to him that Greg was taking Maggie home at the time. If he was that bad, and Keith let her get in that car? Then another thought occurred to him. Wait a minute. How'd she get home? We called her a cab. She wouldn't take no for an answer. But it had to have been, what, midnight or better when she got home? That's what I kept trying to tell her, but I'm telling you that lady's got a will of steel. That much Keith knew. I think I'm going to ask her to our company picnic, Greg said. Oh, when's that? Keith asked, as if he was still breathing. Saturday after next, the 15th. I hope she'll come. We really had a good time together the other night. Keith thought asking the next question just might kill him. So you haven't asked her yet? No, we talked the other night until like midnight, but it was just general stuff. My work, her work, college. This conversation was making Keith nauseous. Listen, man, I've got to get back to work, or Ike's going to skin me alive when he gets back tomorrow. 'Kay, but don't be a stranger. I couldn't get any stranger, could I? Hey, Greg laughed. You said it, not me. They signed off, but it took Keith a full minute to get his body to move again. Greg was going to ask her out again. That was bad news. They had talked until midnight. That was very bad news. Well, it was good news, but as good as it should have been, it hurt like everything. And then there was the whole issue of her taking Greg home. What did they do when they got to his place? Keith knocked that thought away with a solid thwack. He didn't want to hate Greg. Greg had been there through some of the toughest times of Keith's life. But how do you watch the woman you are falling in love with walk off into the sunset with a man who has been your best friend for 15 years? They were questions with no answers. Finally, with no better option, Keith pried himself from the wall. There was work to be done. That was the only thing that didn't seem to be complicated anymore. Keith was sprawled out next to the jack on the spare trailer Tuesday afternoon, fixing another flat with a patched tire. At the rate they were going, they could outfit NASCAR with all the tires he'd changed in the last month. He needed to go in and get some new ones. He needed to get the track watered down. He needed to feed the horses. Truth was, he needed help because he was about to crack trying to do it on his own. Well, it looks like the operation hasn't completely fallen apart, Ike said, putting his cowboy boot on the trailer's running board as Keith fitted the repaired tire on and spun the lug nuts. Not on my watch. Keith yanked himself to his feet, rubbing the dirt from his hands with a rag. The dirt didn't move much, and he replaced the rag in his back pocket. He grabbed the wrench. We've got to budget for some new tires. These are about to kill me. Put in a request, Ike said. I'll take it up with the manager. Keith stalked by him back to the tire. I just did. Aren't you going to ask how we did? 5th, Keith said. I can read, you know. Gee, you're in a good mood. Huh, I wouldn't know why. You leave me here with 6,000 things to do and no help. Hey, Mr. Ayer, how's it going? Tanner asked, stepping up. It would be better if I had some help with this tire. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. Here, I'll get these. Tanner bent down and started twisting on the lug nuts. See, that's what I mean, Keith said, indicating Tanner. You should hire 4 more of him. Put in a request. Keith glared at him. I just did. Maggie hadn't heard a word from Keith since he dropped them off on Sunday. She knew that was for the best, but it didn't feel like it was. Thursday night, Inez knocked at her door after the kids were asleep. Phone. Maggie knew who it was, but who it was wasn't who she wanted it to be. She tramped downstairs to the phone. Hello? Hey, Maggie, how's it going? Just as she thought. Greg. She dropped onto the chair. Good. How about you? Well, I'll be even better when you say yes. Her head came up from her hand. Yes, about what? About going with me next Saturday. She bit her bottom lip. Where? To my company picnic. They have it every year. We go to the park and eat cold chicken. It's very romantic. Be still my beating heart. So you'll go? Trepidation trounced through her. I don't know. I'll have to find somebody to babysit. How about their parents? She laughed. Like I said, I'll have to see. They were going to have to quit talking until all hours, Maggie decided Friday morning as she yawned at herself in the mirror. 6 hours of sleep was doing nothing for her sanity. Still, it was nice to have a friend. It was nice of him to listen. The picnic sounded fun, except for the part about leaving the kids, and the part about what he might expect from her afterward. This would be their second official date, and at some point, the laws of dating had to kick in. She thought about asking Keith for his assessment of Greg's intentions. It sounded like it should sound like a good idea. The problem was, it didn't. She didn't want to talk about Greg with Keith, just like she didn't want to talk about Keith with Greg. It was very complicated, and getting more so by the second. The cavalry has arrived, Keith said, ducking into the playroom at 4 o'clock on Saturday. He'd had to tell Ike he was going into town for supplies. Town and supplies would have to wait. Right now, he had more important things to do. Oh, hallelujah! I thought you forgot, Maggie said, launching off the carpet. Me? Forget? Never. He arched his chin. Come on, let's get out of here while the getting's good. Quickly, Maggie gathered up the pillows and blankets and the 2 little suitcases. Inez knew where she was going. She hadn't really had the guts to tell anyone else. Keith swung Isabella to his hip and took Peter's hand. Ready? Let's do it. Out the door, down the back stairs, through the kitchen that was filled with catering staff, Keith led the way looking like a Mission Impossible operative. Maggie wasn't arguing. If they got caught, there was no telling what might happen. His pickup was parked just outside the tree line on the road. She carried the contraband and threw it into the pickup. Keith wasted no time getting the 2 kids in, and within 2 minutes, they were gone. Whew, Maggie said, sighing in real relief. That's a little too much intrigue for my taste. He grinned. What, you're not planning to join the CIA? Unless that stands for the Children in America Fund, no. Before she was even settled, they pulled up at the guest house. He guided the pickup around to the back and parked it in the garage. Then he looked at her. And now the fun begins. It was a good thing it was a 2-car garage, because the pickup wouldn't have fit in a single-car garage. The garage, though functional, was spotless. Auto equipment on one side, lawn care on the other. Maggie got out of the pickup and pulled Isabella out as well. She stood the little girl on the concrete. Then she collected the overnight things from the front. Keith was already standing at the door to the house. He scooped Isabella up. Come here, you. She squealed as he put 2 well-placed fingers into her side and tickled her. Then he flipped her over his shoulder, catching her feet. I brought the potatoes, he said over his shoulder at Maggie. I hope you brought everything else. Happiness danced through Maggie. He looked so carefree and peaceful, just as he had leaning against the tree at the waterfall. In the kitchen, he swung Isabella to the floor and flipped his hat to the counter. Underneath was the familiar navy bandana. "There's some blocks in the living room I got out, and, for viewing pleasure," he held up a Nemo DVD. "Oh, here." He reached for the stuff Maggie still had in her arms. "I'll put this down here." She followed him down the hall, admiring how well kept the house was. She hadn't really had much chance to look around on either of her first 2 trips here. Now she took her time, glancing into rooms as they walked. "My office," he said as he passed the first room. "The bathroom. Your room." He smiled at her. "For tonight." At the end of the hall, he turned into the last room. And the kids' room. It wasn't huge, but it was a nice size. Bigger certainly than anything she'd ever slept in until she made it to the mansion. Nice. She walked to the large window overlooking the trees in the direction of the mansion. "It's not the mansion," he said, as if he was apologizing for that. She turned to him. "It doesn't have to be." His gaze fell from her to the things in his hands. "What do we do with these?" "Here." She took them from him and laid them out across the floor next to the window. Peter's stuff and then Isabella's stuff. She had packed clothes for church, too, in case he happened to suggest it. "Here's Peter's blanket. Put that on the bed." She handed over the blue and yellow flannel blanket. "And here's Izzy's." The pink blanket was twined through Isabella's suitcase handle, and it took Maggie an extra tug to get it free. Without really looking at him, she handed it over too. Then she planted her hands on her hips to survey the layout. "I think that's it." He laid the pink blanket out on the carpet. "Cool. What time do you want dinner?" Maggie almost started laughing. "You mean we don't have to be washed and ready 15 minutes early? We won't be inspected? Oh my, I don't know whatever we shall do. We might not know how to act." "They keep you on a pretty tight leash up there, huh?" "That's one way to say it." She stepped past him out the door. "Those two will never know how to make a decision for themselves. Everything is planned down to the second. It's crazy." At the living room end of the hallway, she stepped to the side to let him lead. Although she'd expected him to go to the kitchen, he walked to the living room where Peter and Isabella were playing quietly. "Let's see who can build the biggest tower," Keith said excitedly, joining in the fun on the floor. "Pete, you and me against Maggie and Izzy. Ready?" Maggie barely made it onto the carpet without crashing. "Hey now, you've got to give us a chance." "Oh yeah?" Keith's gaze danced at her. "Go." Maggie laughed as she grabbed blocks from the center of the floor. He was the most alive person she had ever been around, and life with him present was filled with it. 2 hours later, they stood in the kitchen together. Taco meat sizzled in the skillet as he moved around the kitchen that couldn't be called small, except his presence made it feel that way. It was strange, because he wasn't tall and he wasn't even all that big, but he was solid. Solid shoulders, solid thighs, solid arms. Solid in body and heart. And his presence had a way of filling every room he entered. "Tacos and carrots," Maggie said as she stood at the stove, stirring the food in the pans. "What a combination." "I didn't think Iz could eat the shells," he said, as if once again he was apologizing. "Hey," Maggie said over her shoulder. "I was teasing. You did good." He seemed to soak the compliment in. "I got some extra spicy and some mild for the tacos. I didn't know what you liked." "Mild. You put extra spicy in that stuff, and I'll have smoke coming out of my ears." His smile lit his face. "That could be interesting." "Says you." She pulled her wrist up. It was almost 6:30. "We're going to have to hurry. Those two are going to really get thrown off schedule." He split the meat into 2 pans and put the contents of the 2 packages in, stirring each as he did so. "Oh, that would be such a tragedy." She laughed. "It's okay. I'll just blame you." Stirring slowly, he shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." At first, she thought he was slamming himself, but when she looked at him, his wink made her remember when he really had been blamed for something she did. The timer on the stove went off. Here, back up. The shells are ready." He put an oven mitt on his hand to get the cookie sheet out. She shook her head, fighting not to laugh. When the cookie sheet was on the pot holder on the cabinet, he turned and caught her expression. "What?" "You. Is there anything you can't do? You cook, you throw parties, you clean yogurt off of curtains." "I'm a man of many talents." "I can see that." "Is that ready?" "As it'll ever be." "Dinner time." When the food and plates had been transferred to the table, and Peter and Izzy were settled in their seats, Keith sat down and watched Maggie sit across from him. There was no describing that feeling. It filled him all the way to the top with a happiness and a peace he couldn't remember ever feeling. It was so different than sitting here with Dallas. That felt empty and awkward. This felt real, more real than anything he'd ever experienced. "Maggie," he said, watching her. She smiled at him and held her hands out to the children on either side of her. 2 little hands in hers, 2 in his, and she bent her head. "Dear Father in heaven, we praise you for all the wonderful things you have graciously put into our lives. Help us never to take them for granted. We love you, and we praise you. Amen." His amen was husky. It was just so hard to get enough air in for the words to sound normal. Reaching across the table, he picked up Peter's plate and started filling it as she filled Izzy's. "So," he had to clear his throat to get more out, "are we going to church tomorrow?" She was intently filling the plate and didn't so much as glance at him. "I brought their clothes, and I told Inez we might." So she'd thought they might as well. Something about that sent his spirit soaring. If this could just all be for real, that was the one and only thing that could make this feeling any better. A movie, popcorn in the living room. It was like the life Maggie had always dreamed of having, but never thought would come. The kids sat on the floor in front of the television. Maggie sat on one side of the couch, and Keith sat on the other. "I didn't know you were a Nemo fan," she said teasingly. "I told you I'm a man of many talents." "Cool. I think I'll bring Barney over on Monday." He smiled as he put a now shower-cleaned arm over the couch back. She did the dishes, he took a shower. It all felt so normal. The only thing she would have asked now was that he could be sitting beside her with that arm around her. Something told her that would feel even better than this did. "I don't know. I might draw the line at Barney." "I don't blame you. He even gets on my nerves." "Shh," Peter said.
The movie's starting."
Keith laughed softly. "Shh," he mouthed to her. "Behave." "Me?" she mouthed back. "You behave." "I didn't start it." "Oh, yeah? Well, I'm going to finish it if you don't watch it." He raised his eyebrows. "You're getting very brave." Why did he have to look so handsome? It was getting harder and harder to keep her heart from going on little trips with her in his arms as the world slipped by. She grabbed a pillow, anchored it to her chest, and pointed at the television. "Watch the movie and behave yourself." The only good thing that could be said about the bathroom by the time bath time was almost over was that water could be cleaned. The floor was covered in it. Maggie, too, was covered in suds and water from Izzy splashing bubbles and rubbing them all over the white and gray marble tub sides. By the time Keith brought Peter in, the bathroom was awash in water and suds. "You look like a scrubbing bubble," Keith told her, scraping a small handful of suds from her hair. "It's not my fault," she said as Izzy started pounding on the water again, sending suds in 70 directions at once. Maggie tried to wipe them off her face with her sleeve, but it was unclear how successful she was. Ugh, come on, stop that." "I take it the bubble bath was a hit," he said from his position on the floor, where he was removing Peter's clothing. "You could say that." Once again, Izzy started squealing and whacking the water. Suds flew in all directions. Grr, okay, you, that's enough fun for one night. Maggie stood and grabbed a towel. However, still sitting in the tub, the child was covered with suds from every angle. Oh, great. Now, how are we going to get you cleaned off? Here. Keith stood and reached up to release the removable shower head. You pick her up, I'll hose her off. Seeing no better way to do it, Maggie did as instructed. Okay, but you be careful with that. He grinned. Me? I'm always careful. Uh-huh. Yeah, right. Well, you remember that. She lifted Isabella, who was even more slippery from the suds than she normally was. Holding the child up, Maggie shrank back so he wouldn't get her completely soaked as he angled the water at the child. Isabella squealed and kicked. Hey now, you're hard enough to hold on to when you're not doing that. The spray from the hose drizzled up onto Maggie's glasses. Hello, now I can't see. Oh, here, let me fix that. Keith angled the hose around Isabella so that it sprayed Maggie's arm higher, drizzling water all over her. Hey, are you kidding me? I'm not the one taking a bath here. Isabella, Keith said, as if he was mad. You shouldn't get Maggie all wet like that. Isabella squealed and kicked, and on the floor Peter giggled. Maggie's heart lifted at the sound, even as she fought to be mad at him. Finished. Keith shut the water off. He stepped back, but Maggie was still covered with water droplets and holding a dripping, wet, kicking baby. Hello, some help here? Towel, please? He laughed as he pulled the soft taupe towel up from her knees. However, when it was in his hand, he stopped as he looked at them. Who should I dry off, you or her? Let's start with her. Maggie turned, and Keith covered Isabella in the towel. How you ever manage to do this without me every night is beyond me, he said with a wink. Yeah, it's completely unbelievable. But she wasn't mad. She was having the time of her life. She took Isabella, wrapped in the towel, in her arms. Oh, here, you're wet. He put his fingers on either side of her glasses and removed them. I wouldn't know why. She rubbed her face in Izzy's towel. Then she lifted her face for him to replace the glasses. When they were on, he gazed at her. Perfect. The moment froze, and it was as if suddenly she couldn't move. Her breath filled her throat as she gazed into his soft hazel eyes. Move, her brain screamed. But she couldn't. It was as if her body had short-circuited. I'll just go get her ready. Yeah, I'll give Pete a bath. However, neither one of them moved. His eyes held so much that she couldn't get enough of them. Hope, happiness, an offering of a life different than any she had ever lived. Then Isabella kicked in Maggie's arms, and Maggie's attention dropped to her. Okay, let's go. As Maggie walked out, Keith watched her. That was it, her. That's all he ever wanted. Every second he was with her confirmed that fact, and every second he was without her was spent wondering how long it would be before they could be together again. Shaking off the thoughts, he bent down and swept Peter from the carpet. Come here, you. It's your turn. Chapter 16. Isabella was asleep on her little pallet on the floor. Peter was tucked into the big bed. Maggie stepped over to the bed, and Peter's gaze drifted to her.
Where's Keith?
Oh. The question took her off guard, and she glanced back at the door. I'm here, Keith said, pushing the door to gently. You didn't think I'd miss prayers, did you? Maggie couldn't get all the emotions lined up in logical order in her heart. It would have all been so easy if he had just not been Keith Ayer. And minus the hat and the bandana, it was hard not to notice that he was. Pushing those thoughts away, at the bed she knelt on one side, and her heart flipped over when Keith knelt on the other. He reached across the mattress for her hand, and with her heart doing somersaults through her, she laid her hand in his. Strength and safety flooded through her spirit as he held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckle. Praying under these conditions was more than she could do. Just to get a word out was impossible. Closing her eyes, she willed her mind to stay with her. Dear Lord, please be with us tonight. Keep us safe and help us all have a good night's sleep. Please keep all the boys and girls in the world safe and help them all to have a good night. Amen. The two amens blended together, and they yanked tears to her eyes. She sniffed them back and pushed up to her feet. Anchoring her gaze on Peter, she smiled lest it betray her by following Keith up and around the bed. Get some sleep. Peter nodded and snuggled down into the covers. She put her fingers to her lips, kissed them, and put them on his forehead. Good night, sweet prince. She was careful not to trip on Isabella on her way to the door where Keith was already waiting. Ducking, she stepped past him and out into the hall. Her steps took her to the door of her room. Spending more time with him than she had to was dangerous to her heart and to her sanity. You going to bed? He asked, sounding strangely disappointed. She had her arm anchored to her middle. I'd better if we're going to get to church tomorrow. He looked as if he was going to protest, but he just nodded. Okay, see you in the morning. As absurd as it sounded, Maggie was a little disappointed he didn't stop her. But then, that was nuts. She went into her room and pulled her little duffel bag from the floor. The only piece of clothing she had bought on her disaster of a shopping trip was a decent pair of pajamas. She pulled them and the matching robe out of the bag and put them on. The soft blue satin slid across her skin. How life had changed in the last month. Ready for bed, she climbed into the low-rise sleigh bed. Her prayers slid through her with no effort. Her parents, Mrs. Malinowski, the kids, the Ayers, and then his name, as it always did, found its way into her mind. God, please help me find a guy as nice as Keith. That's all I ask. She laid there, replaying the evening in her mind. Start to finish, it had been perfect. Her mind traced over Peter and Izzy sleeping in a strange house, and concern drifted through her. Peter wasn't the most tranquil child on the planet. He probably hadn't slept outside his own room 10 nights since he'd been alive. She had this horrible vision of him lying there all night, listening to the scary sounds of a strange house as she had in each new home she slept in when she was a child. And he would do that too, lie there all night, scared out of his mind and never come get her. That was the kind of kid he was. She listened to the sounds in the house to see if Keith was awake. However, the hum of the dishwasher was the only one. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs out of the bed and grabbed her robe. It wouldn't hurt to check on Peter once more. She went to the door and slid it open. She looked up and down the hall. Nothing. A step, and she was in the hallway. 2 more, and she was at the children's door, her hand securing her robe at her stomach. Softly, she twisted the knob and pushed it open. So she wouldn't have to risk making noise to get it open again, she left it ajar an inch and stepped into the room. Isabella, thumb in mouth, lay on the floor. Her little eyes were closed with the dreams behind them. Maggie smiled at the sight. Then she stepped twice more and found Peter, too, already asleep. To her, that could only mean one thing, that he felt as safe here as she did. That thought slid through her. Grateful tears swept over her heart. Peter deserved to feel safe. They all did. She let her hand brush the comforter as she turned, intending to head back to the door, but the glow at the window stopped her. Intrigued, she stepped over to it, trying to determine the origin of the soft glow in the nighttime sky. The thought hit her. The party. Yes, it would be going on up on the hill beyond. The break in the yard trees allowed the glow to be visible only in pieces, but it was there just the same. Thoughts and memories swarmed through Maggie, and she pulled her arms to her chest to deflect them. One hand rubbed slowly up the other arm as she stood there, lost in yesterday, gazing into it as if it was right there in front of her. Keith was on his way back to his room from getting a drink when he noticed that the kid's door wasn't shut. That was odd. His first thought was Peter. Maybe he had already gotten scared and had gone to find someone to make it better. However, with a glance, he realized that Maggie's door was shut tight. Something wasn't right, but he decided to check it out before he bothered her. With the lightest touch on the kid's door, it opened, and there in the pale light of the window stood Maggie. The waves of hair, the curves, there was no one else it could be. His heart snagged on the sight. There was something so intimate about it, as if she knew no one knew she was there. For a moment he thought about leaving before she knew he was there, but then he heard the soft sniff of overwhelming ache, and concern traced through him. Wanting not to scare her, but to help just the same, he stepped into the room and over to where she stood. "Maggie?" She turned to him, and the anguish in her eyes overtook his heart with the hard whack of a 2x4 across the chest. Her face contorted, and she closed her eyes, squeezing them to stop the pain. But it squeezed out tears instead. They rolled down her cheeks on the paths others had already made. "Maggie, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. The words seemed to jam without ever making it to the air. It was all he could think to do. "Hey, shh, come here." He pulled her into his arms and vowed to hold her there until all the tears were vanquished. Maggie knew she should pull away. It wasn't right for her to be here in his arms, soaking in his strength as her grief poured out of her heart. But the truth was, she needed him right now, more than she had ever needed anyone. The memories were too much for her to bear alone. They were too heavy and too overwhelming. So many nights spent thinking about the one that had changed hers forever. So many days spent trying not to think about it. With her head on his chest, she let her tear-blurred gaze drift out to that glow in the night sky beyond the trees, and the grief hit again. She pulled her hand to her mouth, trying to get her brain to stop thinking. The tears were going to drag her down until she might not get to the top of them again. Still, gently, solidly he stood, just holding her and letting her grief run its course. Her thoughts bounced back and forth from present to past as waves of anguish gushed over her. It was a night just like this one, early spring. It was a party just like that one, the social event of the season. The man, she'd never had a name for him, just the man. He had partied, and then he left and changed her life forever. Sorrow reached up and yanked a sob from her, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. Thinking ceased, and feeling took over. And oh, the feelings she had thought were buried so deep, anger, hurt, fear, grief, sorrow. The sorrow was the worst of them, because it was the one that couldn't be controlled. She had known that almost from the very beginning. It was the one that would never let her go if she ever let it to the surface. And now it was here, dragging her down into its undercurrent, yanking at her with a grip that said it would never let her go. Another sob wrenched free, and Maggie had the horrible sensation that she was drowning in the grief. Her knees went weak beneath her, and the only reason she was still standing was because he was holding her up. "Shh," he said, and she realized he was stroking her hair. "Shh." His hand on her hair felt so good, so soothing. His arm around her felt like strength itself. Every rational part of her said she should pull away, that he was going to think she was a complete idiot. But her legs wouldn't move and her body felt shaky and weak. Tired washed through her spirit, taking rational thought with it. She let her will melt into the fatigue. Life itself slipped away from her grasp, and she let go and watched it leave. They were gone. They were really gone. And they were never, ever coming back. Her grief gave way to a blank numbness as she sniffed and wiped at the tears. She pulled in air in short little gasps and sniffs. Still, he didn't let her go. "Come on," he said softly, and she nodded. Why, she didn't know. All she knew was that here, with him, she was safe. He would take care of life while she was unable to. That thought was comforting, although she couldn't really put it all into words as to just why. His arm never left her as he guided her out the door and down the hallway to the living room. Once there, he sat down with her on the couch. She leaned into him, her grief overspilling its banks again. He didn't question it. He just held her until this spasm, too, had passed. "Do you know what I remember?" she asked, and it was as if she didn't feel any need to start at the beginning. "What's that?" "I remember waking up the next morning and wondering why they hadn't come." She shook her head. "I don't even remember the night before. I've tried, but I really don't remember them leaving. I was going to stay at a friend's house, so it really wasn't a big deal. But I remember waking up on that couch the next morning and wondering why I was still there and not in my bed." She let out a soft laugh. "It's weird. I can still picture that room. Man, it's like it was yesterday. It was yellow, not like a bright yellow, but a really pale mustard yellow, and the curtains were white, so there was this really intense kind of light everywhere. It's weird, because I thought for a moment I must be in heaven, and then I realized I wasn't." Her mind let the memories come freely. She felt no need to edit them. "I laid there for like the longest time trying to figure out why I wasn't in my bed. I don't know that I had ever not waked up in my bed, so it was weird, you know? And then I remembered they were supposed to come get me. They'd told me 11 or something like that. But here it was morning, and they still weren't there to get me." She squinted into the memories, trying to pull them up, but they'd been buried so long it was difficult. "I don't know if I even knew something was wrong at that point or not. I just thought there must have been a mix-up." Her heart snagged on the next memory. "But when I walked into that kitchen and Mrs. Davidson was sitting at that table," she let out the memory in a slow exhale. "When she looked at me." Maggie had to take a breath on the memory of the woman, her eyes red and tear-stained. That look, that one look had changed her life. Everything happened so fast after that. There were all these people around and everyone was talking all quiet. I really didn't understand what was going on, just that I was alone and Mom and Dad weren't there. And then even the other people left. They all left." She stopped. Thoughts that had been there her whole life, although she had never said them out loud, came through her. "You know, I've always wondered what would have happened if he'd have left 2 minutes later. Just 2 minutes. Everything would have been so different." "Your dad?" asked Keith, and the sound of his voice surprised her. She jerked her head up and then lowered it because she was having too much trouble dealing with the past to deal with the present, too. No. In a strange way, she had never thought about the fact that her parents could have left later. Somehow, that had never occurred to her. They were right where they should have been. It was the other guy who shouldn't have been there. The guy that hit them. Keith absorbed that blow. For no real reason, he had never realized there was another driver involved. It was his fault? On his chest, she nodded. He was drunk. The breath he had been taking vanished. In its absence, 100,000 pieces of things she had told him and things she hadn't fell into place. He wanted to say something, but nothing would come. Her world had been ripped apart by someone else's thoughtlessness, and in the next second, the understanding of how many times that could have been him smashed into him. How many times had he told his friends he was perfectly fine to drive, when the reality was he really wasn't? How many bars had he left, never thinking of whose life was between him and home? Too many, that was for sure. So, Do you know what happened? She was shaking a little, cold he suspected, so he reached over and pulled the little throw blanket from the couch edge. Gently he put it around her, the blanket sliding easily over the soft blue material of her robe. Once it was there, he slid his hand up and down her arm for reassurance that he was still there. "He ran a stop sign," she said softly. "There were no skid marks at all. They were both killed instantly. It was just a mess of smashed metal when it was over. Nothing recognizable at all." "So you saw the car?" Inexplicably, she shook her head. "That's what everybody said, but they never took me to see it." Her voice sounded hollow, as if there was no feeling beneath the memories. "It's so weird. I've gone through that night 1,000,000 times in my head. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd try to picture the accident. Who was there, how dark it was, the lights, the sounds. I don't know. It's like if I could find something that could have been changed, something that didn't add up, it would bring them back like it never happened. Like if I could somehow find some evidence that God had overlooked, that he would have to reverse his decision and let them come back." She exhaled at that thought. "Pretty stupid, huh?" "No, you're just trying to make some sense out of something that doesn't make any sense." The hollowness returned to her voice and her breathing. "He was supposed to get time." She squinted into the memories. Manslaughter something, but he paid his way out of it. Once again, Keith's breathing snagged on the statement. "He walked away?" She nodded. "Just like I did, only I never got over it." Her hand pulled the robe's belt out slowly and then let it drop. "I wonder if he ever did." The story wound through Keith, pulling up memories as it went. "That's why you drove Greg home." "Huh?" Her head moved, and this time she sat up, although she swayed with a movement. Now, looking at her sitting there was so much he wanted to say, but no real way to say it all. "He told me about the other night, how you took him home." Her gaze dropped to the carpet. She tried to crush the feelings flooding through her face back down. "I didn't want." She put her hand to her nose to stop the tears. Soft gentleness for the courage she showed in the face of such a struggle drifted through him. He reached over and laid his hand on her back. "I know." She looked back at him, and the tears overtook her again. "It's just so unfair. I wish no other kid ever had to go through this. I wish I could make it so that every kid had a home and parents who cared. I hate it that any kid ever has to be afraid and alone. None of them deserve that." Keith watched her, and neither did you. Her tongue drifted under her top lip as she fought the tears, but they were too strong. Her face crumpled into the pain again, and she gasped the breath in. Gently he reached over and pulled her back to his chest. She didn't fight it, and for that he was glad. He wanted her to know he was here for her, that she could share her grief, and he would help her through it the best he could. Her cheek and hand rested on his chest, and he could feel her soft sobs. He wanted with everything in him to say something that would make it better, but what could he say? What could anyone say? It had all been said in one thoughtless, reckless act by someone he would never know. "Thank you," she said softly. He tilted his head to be able to see her. "For what?" "For listening. I've never told anyone that before." Gratefulness for her trust in him drifted through him. He hugged her tighter and kissed the top of her hair. "Hey, I'll always be here for you, no matter what." When Maggie woke up the next morning, her heart still hurt, but in a different way now. Now it was with the undeniable understanding that she wasn't carrying this pain alone, and somehow, in some strange way, that helped. In the kitchen, she found him making eggs and sausage with Peter perched on the cabinet. "Good morning," she said, her happiness not a total facade, although she did have a headache. "Morning." Keith smiled at her and then grew serious. How are you?" "Good," she nodded. "I could use some aspirin, though." "2 aspirin coming up." He reached into the cabinet above Peter. "Excuse me, Mr. Ayer." Peter giggled as Keith leaned him to the side and grabbed the bottle. He produced the aspirin and handed them to her. "There's orange juice in the refrigerator and milk on the table." She took the aspirins and grabbed a glass from the table to pour some milk. "How long have you been up?" "Since Peter knocked on my door at 6:15. Keith reached over and tickled his fellow chef. "We got up and played Mario." "Mario?" Maggie's displeasure slid through her. "Before breakfast?" "Not our fault some people sleep all day, huh, Peter?" "All day?" Maggie checked the clock. "It's 7:30. "Like I said," Keith grinned at her wickedly, "if you're not up at the crack of dawn, we're wasting daylight, as Ike would say." Maggie knew he hadn't meant them to sting, but the words did anyway. She pulled her robe around her a little tighter. "Well, I'm going to go get ready and get Izzy up, unless you need a woman's help to finish this." "A woman?" Keith asked Peter. "We don't need no stinking woman, do we?" Although she was sure Peter didn't fully understand the comment, he grinned and shook his head anyway. "Fine," she said, flouncing on the word. "But if you burn down the house, don't come whining to me." "How many times have we cooked eggs and never needed her help?" Keith asked Peter, as Maggie walked to the hallway. "Now she thinks we're going to burn the place down without her? Huh, like we would do that." Maggie laughed. He was crazy. It seemed Keith could spend hours with her, and no matter how many there had been, he always wanted just a few more. "Want to go eat?" he asked after church. "No, we're probably pushing our luck. We'd better get home." He nodded. He knew that as well as she did, but still, he wanted to find some way to stave off her leaving, some excuse for her to stay. "You want to go riding today?" Her gaze was softly apologetic. "We better put in some FaceTime at the mansion, or someone's going to get suspicious." Suspicious of what, he didn't really know or care. All he cared about was that she was leaving, and there was nothing he could do about it. "I'll get Pete," Keith said, sliding out. "I can get it," Maggie said quickly. She grabbed the suitcases and blankets. If she could just get away from him without letting him know she didn't want to leave, somehow she could go on with life as if the last night had never happened. "You can get it?" He laughed at her. "Yeah, and I'm Houdini." He slid Peter to the ground. "Down you go, buddy. Go help Maggie with the pillows." Maggie gave him one, but it dragged the ground. She had to check her heart rate as Keith came to her side carrying Peter's car seat to get Isabella out. Amazingly, he managed to snap the second car seat out with Isabella planted on his hip. They started up the walk, laden with kids and equipment. "You know, for 2 little kids, you guys sure don't travel light." "You think this is bad? You should see their rooms." Maggie's gaze slid back to him as she opened the kitchen door and they walked in. He laughed, then his gaze traced past her, and the smile fell. "Oh, good morning," he said, visibly straightening, and Maggie knew it was bad even before she turned around. Gathering her courage, she turned slowly. It was worse than she ever could have imagined. She fought to find her own smile, which had evaporated as thoroughly as his had. "Mr. Ayer, Mrs. Ayer, good morning." Mr. Ayer was the first to get anything out. "Would someone like to explain this?" "I'm sorry, sir," Maggie started. "Patty Ann said that you all were not to be disturbed last night, so we—" "We?" he asked, looking at Keith. Well, she glanced back at Keith, who stood staring at his father. "I mentioned to Keith that we weren't really invited, and—" "That did not give you the right to take our children out of the house without our permission," Mrs. Ayer said. Maggie deflated. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would be a problem if we just went to Keith's. I told Inez." "And thus we haven't called out the National Guard," Mr. Ayer said.
But we are still not pleased that you didn't tell us where you were going. We do not appreciate our children being taken just anywhere. Who knows what could have happened to them?"
"But we weren't just anywhere. We were at Keith's." She looked back at him, but his face was rock hard.
"I should go,"
he said. He smiled at her, kind of, handed Isabella to her, and then he dropped the other stuff to the floor and shoved through the kitchen door with a bang. The last she saw of him was that familiar stride, stomping down the walk. To say she didn't understand anything at all about the situation would have been an understatement. However, understanding wasn't going to help her much anyway. She turned back to face the wrath of people she had no real way of placating. "I'm really sorry. We would have been back earlier, but we went to church." That seemed to stop Mr. Ayer. His face dropped into incomprehension.
"Church? You went to church?"
"Yeah." She felt Peter at her knee, and she reached down to shield him from any ugliness. Her heart was pounding in fear, and she was sure his was too. "Keith's been taking me sometimes. Not all the time, just a few times. I know we should have told you that too. I'm sorry." Mr. Ayer's gaze surveyed her in a way she couldn't quite read.
"Keith went to church?"
She wasn't sure what the right answer to that question was, so she tried the honest one. "Yes." "And you've taken the children?" Mrs. Ayer asked, clearly furious. "Yes, ma'am." That was it. She was fired. She was sure of it. "I do not believe this," Mrs. Ayer said, standing. "Miss Montgomery—" "Vivian." Mr. Ayer's hand on her wrist stopped her, and she looked down in consternation. With a gaze heavy with haze, he looked up at his wife.
"May I speak with you?"
He glanced at Maggie and the kids.
"Privately?"
Mrs. Ayer didn't look at all happy, and it took her a long time to answer. "Fine." They walked out. It would have been nice to be relieved, but Maggie couldn't get all the way there. True, she hadn't been fired outright, but it was less than clear that she wouldn't be when they came back. Seconds turned to minutes, then she heard the whimper. Peter. Carefully she spun right where she had been standing. She sat on her heel and hugged him to her. "Hey, baby, shh, it's okay."
Where did Keith go?
Peter rubbed his eyes, and she knew it was getting time for lunch and a nap. "Keith had to go home, sweetheart." At least she hoped that was where he had gone. She pulled Peter to her again, and as she kissed his hair, her gaze went through the window in the kitchen door to the outside. The pickup was long gone. He was upset. The bang of the door had told her that, and it was bad. The look on his face told her that. She wished she could somehow turn back time and start over. She shouldn't have asked him to help her. She should have made the best of it at the mansion.
"Miss Montgomery,"
Mr. Ayer said, striding into the room. Mrs. Ayer followed him, her arms folded at her chest. Maggie stood and waited for the death sentence to be pronounced.
"We are not happy that you did not inform us you had taken the children. But,"
he paused as his gaze went to his children,
"we believe you had their best interest at heart."
His gaze leveled back on her.
"In the future, we expect you to inform us where the children will be at all times."
Okay. She shouldn't have had any courage left, but to her heart, this was important. "We have gone riding a couple of times at the stables and to church. Will those be acceptable if I tell Patty Ann where we're going?" Mr. Ayer looked like she had punched him.
"So long as you tell Patty Ann."
Mrs. Ayer didn't look at all pleased, but he turned and ushered her out before she could take a whack at Maggie. When they were gone, Maggie finally took a breath. "Come on, you two. We'd better get you ready for lunch." She was gone. Of that much Keith was certain. He should have been smart enough to nix the idea of them coming to his place when it first came up. Of course his father would never approve of them going to his place. That thought knifed through his heart. He loved those kids, and to be treated as if he wasn't good enough to be around them hurt. He tried to find something to do at his place, but after an hour of frustration, He decided it would be best to go get some work done. He pulled on his faded blue jeans and grabbed a sleeveless shirt. If she was gone, what was the point of wanting to be here? He might as well move to the woodlands now and get it over with. That thought brought him up short. He'd never called the realtor as Dallas had told him to. Frustration at being treated like a 3-year-old no matter where he went crawled through him. It was like none of them cared what he thought. They knew what was best. He was supposed to follow along. At the stables, he noticed Tanner's beat-up pickup, but Ike's was nowhere to be seen. That was a relief. At least he wouldn't have to go more rounds with the newest manager. Keith stalked into the stables and met Tanner, who was tossing hay to the horses. "Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Ayer. I didn't know you were scheduled today." "The house was getting to me." "Tell me about it," Tanner said. "My roommates were getting on my nerves." "The silence was getting on mine." At that moment, a blonde-headed young lady stepped out of the office. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know there was anybody else here." Keith stopped and looked at her, trying to fit her into a logical place. It wasn't until Tanner walked over to her and laid his arm around her that Keith figured it out. "Mr. Ayer, this is my girlfriend, Jamie. Jamie, this is Mr. Ayer." Keith held out his hand. "Keith, please." She smiled and shook his hand. "I'm sorry. I was just helping Tanner so we could go out tonight." When Keith stepped back and surveyed her, it was clear that she was indeed in work clothes. "I didn't think you would mind," Tanner said, and the strain of apprehension was evident. Happiness for them drifted through him. They were lucky to be together without a million things standing in their way. "I don't mind. Glad to have you aboard, Jamie." "Thank you, Mr. Ayer." She caught his look. "Keith." "The interview is Thursday," Dallas said that evening as Keith's real life crashed in around him. 10 a.m. You should email me your resume so I can go over it." "I know how to do a resume." He sat at the table over his dinner that was already cold. Eating didn't sound appealing. Living didn't even sound appealing. Finally, he stood and took his dish and the phone to the sink. "Still, you haven't had much practice with things like this," Dallas said. "I'd hate for you to mess up this chance. It's such an incredible opportunity." "I won't mess it up, Dallas." "I didn't mean mess it up, like be an idiot, but you have to understand these companies are not your father. They aren't going to overlook the details." "What details about me do they need to overlook?" Frustration seeped through him. "You know what I mean, Keith. You don't exactly have an extensive history outside your father's influence." That would have been a challenge. "I worked all while I was in college, and I was the manager for the racing operation here from the time I graduated. We've turned out a profit on the racing every single year, and this year our revenues are on pace to double." Dallas sounded less than impressed. "That's good for a hobby, but a real company—" "Listen, Dallas, I've got things to get done." "But we haven't even talked about the house. Did you call Jane at the realtor office? She needed to know what our offer would be." "What is our offer going to be?" "Well, that depends if we go through the bank or if your dad will underwrite us." Keith scratched his head. "We'd better go with the bank. I don't really want to be tied to family if at all possible." Her side went quiet. "It's going to be hard for us to do it on our own, with neither of us having a real job yet." "I have a real job." "You know what I mean. The bank needs something more solid than what we plan to do. Are you sure you can't ask your dad? That would really help." "I'll see what I can do." "Have you talked to him about the jet?" Dallas asked. "I talked to Rachel, and she might catch a ride with us." "Who's Rachel?" "Oh, a friend from Advanced Legal Theory. She lives in Tennessee." "But we'd be coming to Texas." "Well, yeah, but Tennessee's right on the way." "Right?" Keith was having trouble breathing. Dallas seemed to take it for granted that not only was whatever hers, but that apparently included whatever was his father's as well.
we're going to have to talk about this whole plane thing.
Oh, Keith, I'm sorry. Heather just showed up. We're going to dinner. Ristorante Rapucci. He had no idea what Ristorante Rapucci was, but the fact that she pointed it out must mean it was expensive and meant to impress him.
Oh, okay.
I'll talk to you tomorrow night.
Oh, good. Something to look forward to. See ya.
And they signed off. When Keith hung up, it was like dropping a 50-pound pack. He sat down on the couch with a thump. He wiped his hand over his face, trying to block out the last 24 hours. But that wasn't easy. Her on the couch, in his arms, reliving a nightmare he wished she had never been through. Then, this morning in the mansion's kitchen, why was it, even when he helped, they found a way to throw him to the ground and then kick him in the gut? Dallas was right. He needed to call the realtor. He needed to get out of here before they permanently killed his spirit and everything he'd ever managed to put together underneath him. As he stood and headed for the back, he wondered if she was gone. Probably. And, with everything in him, he tried to convince himself that was for the best. Chapter 17. The interview was all but a disaster. Keith knew it the minute he sat down in the chair, and it only went downhill from there. Lee Farrell was the kind of guy who made you feel an inch high and about as worthless as a maggot-infested donkey. Oh, he talked a good game, but Keith knew without a shadow of a doubt that Mr. Farrell would never so much have said hello had Keith not had the connections he did. Never in his life had he been so glad to leave a place. When the phone rang Thursday night, Keith had the feeling of falling into a black hole of self-flagellation. This would be a lesson in humility he could do without. Hello? Hey, how'd the interview go? Dallas asked, sounding far too enthusiastic about it for Keith's taste. Fine. You got it, right? I mean, he offered you the job, right?
I don't know. He said he'd get back to me.
That stopped her short. Oh, well, it's just a matter of time. Have you called on the house yet? The house. Why was that so hard to remember?
I was going to, but I couldn't find the number.
I left it on your desk with all the other information. She didn't sound pleased. Come on, Keith. You've got to get on this. That house is going to sell, and then we'll have to start all over.
Look, I've been a little busy here. We're trying to get Dragnet ready. Ike and Tanner are heading out again with Transistor.
Oh, good grief. Enough about the stupid horses already. This is our future we're talking about here. Can't you get anything right? The shot found its mark. He shifted on the couch to keep from screaming.
Listen, Dallas, I'm not yelling at you about whether or not you've got every little picky detail done. I do have a life, you know?
Playing horses is not a life. It's a hobby, if that. You need a real job, Keith. Now, don't screw this up for me. I do not want to come home to an unemployed husband who doesn't have a house for me to live in. The conflagration was flaring into dangerous territory.
Fine. I'll get it done. Is there anything else you need?
He stopped only one syllable short from calling her Your Highness. Yes, you need to stop by the caterers and give them the final menu and head count. I'll email that to you. The invitations are all out, so that's taken care of. Down the list they went, and for everything in him, Keith wanted nothing more than to hang up on her. After 5 minutes of lists and tasks, she finally took a breath. It would be really nice if we could get into the house by the end of May. That way, we could get it set up with our gifts, and when we get home from Hawaii, it'll be all ready for us.
Yeah, okay. Keith just wanted to get off the phone. Hawaii had never sounded so much like hell. Listen, I've got to go, and I'm sure you've got studying to do.
Yeah, some, she sighed. I wish I was there with you."
He couldn't even say it. "Yeah, well, good luck with everything. I'll talk to you soon." In all their talks, Maggie had never thought to ask Greg for his number. The number of Parkers in the Houston phone book was staggering, and she wasn't about to call every Greg, Gregory, and G plus varied initials listed. So, Thursday night with a sigh, she resorted to corralling Inez long enough to plead for Keith's number. She wouldn't have done it, but she saw no good way around it. Worse, she felt like a heel for not having called him sooner. It was just that her previous attempts hadn't panned out. Even though the Ayers had left that morning for several large Washington fundraisers over the weekend, Maggie knew that taking a day off at this point could be a deal-breaker. Besides, there was no way she was going to put the children in jeopardy over a company picnic. So, Thursday night, she waited until the mansion was quiet and the kitchen quieter. Then she snuck downstairs to the phone. Even 2 long exhales weren't enough to settle her nerves. Her heart pounded in her ears as she dialed the number. "Please be home, please be home." "Hello?" Man, she loved that voice. Her smile came without her willing it to. "Hey, how's it going?" There was the longest pause of her life on the other end. "Maggie?" "Yeah, it's me." She sat down in a heap on the chair. She raked her fingers through her hair, jerking once to get her fingers all the way through it. "Listen, I won't keep you, but I wanted to say I'm sorry about the other day. I should have told them where I was going." He sighed. "Yeah, well, they probably wouldn't have let you come if they had known." There were so many questions surrounding that answer that Maggie could scarcely count them all. "Well, for the record, I am glad we went even if I got into trouble over it." "So they didn't fire you then?" "No," she sighed. "Not this time, anyway." The words were there, but she had to force herself to say them. "Listen, the real reason I was calling was to find out if you know Greg's number." "Greg's? Why?" "Oh, brilliant me. I kind of said I'd go with him to his company picnic, and now it looks like it's just not going to work." "Oh, why not?" She sighed again, her spirit dragging down with a weight. "Well, the Ayers left this morning for Washington, and I never got the guts to ask for Saturday off. Now that they're gone, I really can't just ask off." "Have you had a day off since you started?" "One, the night of your party, but I just can't take off this weekend. It's just not going to work." As thrilled as Keith should have been about that, nothing in him was. She deserved to be happy, and if Greg made her happy, then Keith would do everything he could to see that she got that chance. "Why don't you just ask Patty Ann to get a babysitter?" Maggie hesitated. He waited, but she said nothing. "Would that really be so bad?" I just wouldn't feel right leaving them here with someone they don't know, especially when their parents are gone." "You could leave them with Patty Ann." He laughed at his own joke. "Yeah, and Attila the Hun might be available too." She didn't sound like she was laughing. In fact, she sounded downright despondent. "Besides, Patty Ann went with them, so—" He hated himself for what he was about to say. If there was a way around it, he would have pounced on it. But there wasn't. "So, do you want to go to this deal with Greg?" "Well, yeah. I mean, he's a nice guy. We have fun together and everything. Plus, I'd hate to back out now." Keith exhaled. How he would ever get the words out of his mouth, he had no idea. They stung just thinking them. "Maybe I could babysit." Maggie didn't say anything. "Maggie, where'd you go?" I'm here." "Well, what do you think? I could come to the mansion whatever time you need me on Saturday. I'd love to spend some time with Pete and Izzy. Only Inez would know, and if I know Inez, she wouldn't say anything to Patty Ann." "But I'd hate to ask you to do that. You've got work and—" "Not on a Saturday night, I don't." Keith laughed. "It would beat cleaning my house." Again, her side was silent. "What?" he finally asked. "Do you think they would mind? I mean, if they found out?" He didn't know how much she knew, but she obviously knew enough. "It's one afternoon and evening. Inez will be there. We'll tell them it was a last-minute thing." Still, she didn't say anything. "Maggie?" "Why would you do that? You could get in trouble covering for me, again." "Maybe I like to walk on the wild side." As planned, Keith showed up right at 2 o'clock on Saturday. He went in the back door, having left his pickup at the guest house. This way, if something bad went down, Inez could take over and he could slip out the back. "Good afternoon," he said to Inez, who stood at the sink peeling carrots. She shook her head, and when she smiled, the dimples on her cheeks stood out. "You are a piece of work, you know that?" He walked over to the carrots and popped one in his mouth. "How's that?" "You just keep showing up like they actually want you here." He put a hurt look on his face. "You don't want me here?" She put a hand on her hip and shook her head. "I shouldn't. If they find out about this, you're toast." "That's why they are not going to find out about this." He lowered his gaze at her. "Right? This is between us." Inez glanced back at the stairs. "Babysitting? You've never offered to babysit before." "Not true. I did a lot when Pete was first born. They just wouldn't let me." She still didn't look convinced. "You seem to be sticking your neck out a lot recently. Do you have a death wish or what?" Keith grabbed another carrot and popped it in his mouth. "I'm getting married, aren't I?" The doorbell rang and Inez reached down to wipe her hands. However, Keith held up his. "Don't move, I'll get that." He strode through the mansion to the front door. One peek through the sidelight told him this was in fact happening. Wrenching the doorknob, he swung the door open. "Well, well, look who found their way back." "Keith?" Greg looked positively stunned. "I didn't know they would let you within 30 yards of this place." "Ha ha." Keith stepped back and Greg walked in. Careful not to let his emotion slam the door, Keith closed it. "You here for Maggie?" Greg readjusted the light green cotton shirt. Yeah, is she ready?" "I don't know. Just a second, I'll go check." Keith was determined to remain light and cheerful, as if this wasn't killing him. That worked all the way up until he met her coming quietly out of her room. The turquoise and white striped shirt always did funny things to his stomach. "Greg's here." Maggie spun like she'd been caught stealing the Hope diamond. "Oh, man, do you have to sneak up on people like that?" He smiled. "Only the ones I like." She looked at him then with a face full of hope and fear. "Are you sure this is okay? I don't want you to miss work for me." "It's fine. I'm fine. The kids will be fine." At least he could say the words like he meant them. "Go. Have fun. Don't worry about us." Still, she didn't look convinced. Her gaze traveled down to her shirt and white skirt. "Is this okay?" She smoothed down the shirt. "I don't want to look overdressed." The words drifted through him, touching with an ache every soft spot. "You look amazing." With Keith right behind her, Maggie made her way down the stairs, hoping she wouldn't fall, and wondering how she was ever going to make it out that door with both Greg and Keith in the room. Midway down, she caught Greg gazing up at her, and she smiled and pushed a stray strand of hair over her ear. "Wow, you're going to put all the other ladies there to shame," Greg said. When she stepped off the bottom stair, he stepped over to her and put his arm around her. "You look beautiful." Nerves overtook her then. It was bad enough for him to say it. It was worse for Keith to be standing right there to hear it. "Well, Keith, we'll see you." Greg extended his other hand to his friend, although he never removed his other arm from her. Somehow, it was weird to watch Keith shake Greg's hand from this vantage point. "Have fun," Keith said, looking at her in the way that made her knees feel like jelly. We will, Greg said, and he turned to them both and started out. Keith had never been in such a battle in his life. Not one part of him wanted to let them walk out that door and down that walk, but he knew it could be no different, and thinking that it could would only cause everyone heartache that they didn't deserve. Softly, he closed the door, but he couldn't just leave, so he stepped to the side light and pulled the light sheer curtain there back ever so slightly. They looked good together in a way that ripped his heart out. They would be good together, good for each other. Greg needed someone patient and kind and strong, and Maggie deserved to be treated well by a genuinely nice guy. It was just that watching it happen knifed through him with an intensity he hadn't counted on. The little sports car drove away smoothly, and somehow every moment of watching her slip farther away made it hurt all the more. Are they gone? Inez asked from her leaning post on the breezeway to the kitchen. Keith glanced at her, knowing he was busted. Yeah. She gazed at him for a long moment. Do you want to talk about it? There were certain people in the world that Keith knew or thought he knew he could trust. Ike had been on that list until recently. Inez had been on it until he left for college. You still make those chocolate shakes like you used to? She smiled. I think I might remember. The drive to the park had to be one for the memory books. Spring had definitely arrived. Blue bonnets and orange paintbrushes washed everything that wasn't green in breathtaking color. The day would have been absolutely perfect, save for the fact of who she was here with. So, are you planning on working for the Ayers forever? Greg asked, glancing over at her. His strong hands with long fingers rested easily on the steering wheel. I'm surprised I'm still there. Her fingers played with her skirt. Oh, why's that? Maggie shrugged, although her gaze was down. I'm not exactly cut out for living like the rich and famous. Give me a little house in a little town with a little grass and a few kids, and I'll be more than happy. He glanced at her. No big fancy parties? She shook her head. Just someone who loves me and enough money to live. She hadn't seen it coming, and if she had, she didn't know if she would have had time to react. But suddenly his hand was over hers. His fingers fell in the space between her thumb and her palm. Her heart leaped into gear as her gaze jumped to his. His look was laced with a smile. Maybe that dream isn't as far away as you think. Okay, Keith, what gives? You haven't been around this place this much in 5 years, and now, every time I turn around, there you are again. Inez set the frothy drink in front of him, seemingly as a bribe to get him to open up. However, he didn't want to go there. Do you remember when we used to drink these when I was little? Do I? What I remember is you coming home from football practice, wanting a bag of French fries and 3 of these. Inez laughed. I thought I would never get you full. Keith took a sip. Those were good times. Yes and no, she said, tilting her head to look at him. His heart clogged his chest. I really made a mess of things, huh? How so? High school, college. He hates me now, even more than before. Inez shook her head slowly. He doesn't hate you. He loves you. He just can't figure out how to show that. Yeah, and that's why I've been banished. He treats me like I'm somebody he could fire tomorrow if I step out of square. So, you dance outside the square to prove to him that he can't. He couldn't argue with that, so he didn't. It would have all been so different if she had lived. There was a long, slow exhale from the housekeeper. He is hurting, too. You've got to know that. Keith shook his head. What does he have to be hurting about? He's the king of this place. To him, we're all expendable. He stirred the drink very slowly. It must be nice to know you're not.
Well, in a month, you'll be in your own house with your own wife, leading your own life. That didn't help, although he knew she meant it to. The Hendersons are just like him. I won't be their son-in-law. I'll be their slave. Is that how you feel here? Like a slave? He couldn't say it, so he just nodded. Have you told your dad that's how you feel?
Yeah, right. There's a plan that would get me shipped off to Siberia.
Inez continued to look at him. You know, your mom would never have wanted this. She loved you so much. She would have never wanted you to have gotten run over like you have.
Keith snorted. I think God took the wrong one.
As bad as that sounds, I've thought that too on occasion. But what is it they say? Only the good die young.
Boy, truer words were never spoken.
He spun the glass slowly.
We've been going to the church again, the one she used to take me to.
That stopped Inez. We? He glanced up. Me and Maggie. She lifted her chin, but said nothing.
It's nice, you know. I didn't realize how much I missed it.
Tears sprang to his heart.
It's hard because I remember so much sometimes. The way she was always at my games, the way she would hold those signs up that said, "Yay, Keith." At the time, I thought I was embarrassed by them. Now, I wish I could go back just for a day and feel her arms around me, telling me it will be okay.
You know, she may not be right here telling you that, but I'll bet she is up there in heaven holding those signs up and cheering you on. The tears made it all the way to his eyes.
You think?
Inez smiled.
I know so.
How about here? Greg asked, indicating a semi-vacant table under a tree. Looks good. Maggie followed him and set her plate and cup down on the picnic table. The happy sounds in the park enveloped them. On one side, company team members played tag football. On the other, a myriad of people filled their plates. Must be some company, Maggie said, picking up her fork. Yeah, there's something like 1,000 employees at all the regional firms. A lot of them show up for this. He stabbed into the potato salad. It's good to get in some FaceTime, network, that kind of thing. So, what do you do exactly? He swallowed that bite and took a drink. I work in accounting. I like it pretty well, better than being in the computer wing. You don't like computers? When they work, yes. Hit the button, down comes your answer. I like that. But to try to fix one or program one? No way, not my forte. So, you like living in Houston then? Greg, a middle-aged lady said, walking up with a man behind her. They both sat down. This is my husband, John. Greg wiped his hands on the napkin and then extended it to the older man. He sat for only a second longer. Oh, and this is Maggie Montgomery. Maggie, this is Virginia. She works with me. We're cubicle buddies. Oh, Maggie said. So you're Maggie, Virginia said, gazing at her with a smile Maggie wasn't wholly sure she liked. Greg's been telling me about you. You're the one who works for the Ayers. She ducked her head. Yeah. Must be quite the ticket up there. Do you get your own butler and maid? The pleasant day evaporated from sight. Oh, no, not really. Maggie babysits the kids, Greg offered. Virginia lifted her chin in understanding and then nodded. I bet they're a couple of little brats. This was a true and genuine ambush, and if Maggie had had a little better handle on what she could say and what she couldn't say as a representative of the Ayers, she would have told this woman off. However, the fact that Greg had to work with her, coupled with the fact that she didn't want to embarrass the Ayers, made her hold that thought from finding the air. They're really good kids. Yeah, I bet. Do they pay you to say that? And Virginia let out a whoop the size of the rest of her. And the I-Express flies through the air to the landing pad. Kaboom!
Keith let Isabella drop about 4 inches onto the changing table after the flight up the kitchen stairs. "Okay, you. Let's see how much damage you did." He pulled the pink bloomers down and detached the Velcro. "Ugh! What have they been feeding you?" Isabella laughed. "Yeah, you think it's funny, huh?" His hands worked as he continued to talk to her. "Keith's got to change this nuclear waste diaper. Real funny."
Keith!
She squealed, throwing her arms out to the sides. He leaned down and kissed her. "How could you not just fall in love with that face? You are too cute." "Do you dance?" Greg asked as the band started off to the side. Thankfully, Virginia had gone home and the evening had cooled off. Both welcome turn of events. "A little." Maggie was doing her best to keep tired from her, but it wasn't easy. She wondered about the kids and about Keith. They were probably in bed by now, and she wished with everything in her that she was there with them. "That makes 2 of us. Maybe your little and my little will keep us from being helplessly bad." Greg held his hand out to her, and she put hers in his and stood. He led her to the dance floor, and after only a few sways, she gave up and let the gentle pressure of his hand pull her to him. He was quite a bit taller than her, and only a step up from being truly awkward about holding her. It seemed disingenuous to let him hold her so close, but she was tired, and his presence was the only thing keeping her from falling to the ground and sleeping there until morning. "Thanks for coming with me," he whispered into her hair. She pulled back to look at him. "You're welcome." And then, even as they swayed, he lowered his lips to hers. It was a brush, and barely that, but it set Maggie's alerts on full force. Before she had the chance to react, he pulled her back to him, and she was caught there with no way of extricating herself without breaking his heart. "Now, I'm not very good at this," Keith told Peter as he knelt by the bed. "I don't know all the words like Maggie does."
That's okay,
Peter said, rubbing his eyes.
she taught me how to say it.
Keith's smile danced across his heart. "Okay, then let's hear it."
Dear Jesus, we love you.
The little voice yanked tears to Keith's eyes.
Please be with us tonight, watch over us, and help us have a good sleep. Please keep all the boys and girls in the world safe tonight, and let them know that you love them as much as you love us. Amen.
He could barely get the word out. Amen. Peter was looking at him when he stood. "You get some sleep so we can go to church tomorrow." And with that, Peter closed his little eyes. Keith let himself out of the room and checked his watch. Somehow he'd thought they would be back by now. How long could a picnic last? Unless they had decided to do dinner afterward, or worse, back to Greg's apartment. It was amazing how bad one thought could hurt.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.